on the assembled generals as they gathered around the deathbed of Alexander III of Macedon in June 323 BC. The 32-year-old conqueror's laboured breathing filled the silence, punctuated only by the distant sounds of a city holding its breath. Among the weathered faces surrounding their dying king stood Seleucus, son of Antiochus, a man whose unremarkable appearance belied the ambition that would soon reshape the ancient world. Standing just over average height with the typical Macedonian features of dark hair and olive complexion, Seleucus bore the scars and calloused hands of a professional soldier who had risen through merit rather than birth. As one of Alexander VII's somatophylakes, the elite royal bodyguards who formed the inner circle of the Macedonian military hierarchy, Seleucus had witnessed first-hand the systematic conquest of the Persian Empire. Unlike his more illustrious contemporaries such as Ptolemy, who claimed kinship with the royal house, or Antigonus, whose advanced age commanded respect, Seleucus possessed neither noble lineage nor the gravitas of seniority. His father Antiochus had been a general under Philip II, but this connection provided limited advantage in the brutal politics that would follow Alexander's death. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's demise revealed the fundamental weakness that would plague his successors for the next 4 decades. When asked to whom he left his empire, the dying king allegedly whispered to the strongest, though more reliable sources suggest he was beyond coherent speech. The Macedonian army assembly, traditionally responsible for confirming royal succession, faced an unprecedented crisis. Alexander's half-brother Philip III Aridaeus suffered from severe mental disabilities, while his unborn child by Roxana remained months away from birth. The compromise solution, a joint kingship between Aridaeus and the future Alexander IV under the regency of Perdiccas, satisfied no one and merely postponed the inevitable struggle for power. In the initial partition at Babylon, Seleucus received the satrapy of Babylonia, a region that contemporary observers might have considered a consolation prize compared to the prestigious appointments given to others. Ptolemy secured Egypt with its legendary wealth and natural defences, while Antigonus claimed the strategically vital regions of Phrygia, Lycia, and Pamphylia. Lysimachus obtained Thrace, controlling the crucial crossing between Europe and Asia. Yet Seleucus's seemingly modest allocation encompassed the economic heartland of ancient Mesopotamia, with its sophisticated irrigation systems, established trade networks, and symbolic significance as the seat of both Babylonian and Persian imperial power. The fragile peace established at Babylon crumbled within 2 years as the Diadochi, Alexander's successors, began their relentless struggle for supremacy. Perdiccas, wielding the authority of regent, attempted to maintain central control over the fractured empire, but his heavy-handed methods alienated potential allies. When he invaded Egypt in 321 BC to force Ptolemy's submission, his own officers murdered him during the disastrous campaign, plunging the Macedonian world into open warfare. Seleucus demonstrated remarkable political acumen during these early conflicts, carefully avoiding the mistakes that destroyed other Diadochi. While Eumenes of Cardia exhausted his forces in futile attempts to maintain royal legitimacy, and Antigonus overextended himself in pursuit of Alexander's entire inheritance, Seleucus focused on consolidating his position in Babylonia. He cultivated relationships with the local priesthood, particularly the influential Babylonian astronomers and temple administrators, who controlled vast economic resources. Unlike many Macedonian rulers who viewed local customs with contempt, Seleucus participated in traditional Babylonian religious ceremonies and presented himself as a legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings. The turning point in Seleucus's fortunes came in 316 BC when Antigonus, having eliminated Eumenes and consolidated control over much of Asia Minor and the Levant, turned his attention to Mesopotamia. Antigonus's son Demetrius, already earning his epithet Poliorcetes for his innovative siege techniques, led a massive army eastward to incorporate Babylonia into his father's expanding domain. Faced with overwhelming force and lacking reliable allies, Seleucus made the strategic decision that would define his career. Rather than face certain defeat, he abandoned Babylon and fled eastward toward India. This retreat, which lesser men might have considered a humiliating exile, became the foundation of Seleucus's eventual triumph. The eastern satrapies of Alexander's empire had remained largely autonomous since the conqueror's death, with local rulers maintaining nominal allegiance to whoever claimed central authority while pursuing their own interests. Seleucus's arrival in Bactria and Sogdiana coincided with growing instability along the Indian frontier, where Chandragupta Maurya had begun his systematic conquest of the territories Alexander had briefly held beyond the Indus River. Chandragupta, founder of the Mauryan Empire, represented a new type of Indian ruler who combined traditional subcontinental political concepts with lessons learned from Alexander's campaigns. Unlike the fragmented kingdoms that had fallen to Macedonian phalanxes, Chandragupta had created a centralized state capable of fielding massive armies equipped with both traditional Indian weapons and captured Macedonian equipment. His forces included thousands of war elephants, creatures that continued to terrorize Hellenistic armies decades after Alexander's death. Despite the Macedonians' growing familiarity with these living siege engines. Rather than contest Chandragupta's expansion through costly warfare, Seleucus negotiated the treaty that would transform his strategic position. The agreement, finalized around 305 BC, represented a masterpiece of pragmatic diplomacy that benefited both rulers. Seleucus ceded the territories east of the Hindu Kush, regions that would have been impossible to hold permanently given their distance from Hellenistic population centres and their cultural affinity with the Indian subcontinent. In exchange, Chandragupta provided 500 war elephants, a force that would prove decisive in Seleucus's subsequent campaigns against his Macedonian rivals. The elephants Seleucus acquired were primarily Indian forest elephants, smaller than their African cousins but better suited to the climate and terrain of the Middle East. Each animal stood approximately 8 feet at the shoulder and could carry a crew of 3 or 4 men armed with javelins, bows and long spears. The psychological impact of these creatures on enemy formations often proved more valuable than their direct combat effectiveness, as horses unaccustomed to their scent would panic and infantry formations would break ranks to avoid being trampled. Seleucus's elephant corps became the most formidable in the Hellenistic world, providing him with a decisive advantage in the battles that would follow. The treaty with Chandragupta also established the diplomatic precedent that would characterize Seleucid policy toward the east throughout the empire's history. Rather than attempting to impose direct Macedonian rule over culturally distinct populations, Seleucus recognized the practical limits of Hellenistic power and sought accommodation with indigenous rulers who could provide stability and resources. This approach, born of necessity during his exile, would become a defining feature of Seleucid administration. Returning to Mesopotamia in 312 BC with his Indian allies, Seleucus found the political landscape dramatically altered. Antigonus had become embroiled in conflicts with Ptolemy and Cassander, leaving only a skeleton force to hold Babylon. The city's population, grown weary of Antigonid taxation and military conscription, welcomed Seleucus as a liberator. His restoration to power, which he would later commemorate as the beginning of the Seleucid era, marked the start of his transformation from regional satrap to imperial contender. The administrative system Seleucus established drew upon the diverse governmental traditions of his vast territories, while maintaining the military supremacy essential for Macedonian rule. At its foundation lay the Macedonian phalanx, that revolutionary infantry formation that had conquered the known world under Philip II and Alexander. Seleucus maintained the traditional 16-rank deep formation armed with the sarissa, the 18-foot pike that had broken Persian cavalry charges and Indian elephant attacks alike. However, he adapted the phalanx's composition to reflect the demographic realities of his empire. incorporating Iranian and Mesopotamian recruits alongside Macedonian and Greek settlers. The heavy cavalry, traditionally the decisive arm of Macedonian armies, required more careful management in Seleucid territories. The companion cavalry that had charged beside Alexander consisted primarily of Macedonian nobles, whose families possessed the wealth necessary to maintain war horses and heavy equipment. Seleucus supplemented these traditional units with Iranian horsemen, particularly the renowned Parthian and Bactrian cavalry whose skills had impressed Alexander's generals. These eastern horsemen brought different fighting techniques, including the devastating combination of mounted archery and shock charges that would later characterize Parthian military success. The integration of local administrative practices proved equally crucial to Seleucid success. The Persian Empire had governed its diverse territories through a sophisticated system of satrapies that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Each satrap maintained responsibility for tax collection, military recruitment, and local justice while acknowledging the supreme authority of the great king. Seleucus preserved this framework while inserting Macedonian and Greek officials at key positions, creating a hybrid system that could function effectively across cultural boundaries. Babylonian administrative practices contributed essential elements to this emerging system. The region's ancient tradition of written records, maintained by professional scribes using cuneiform script, provided the bureaucratic foundation necessary for governing a multi-ethnic empire. Seleucus retained the Babylonian practice of detailed record-keeping for tax assessment, land tenure, and legal proceedings, while introducing Greek as the language of high administration. This bilingual approach ensured continuity with established practices while facilitating communication with other Hellenistic kingdoms. The religious dimension of Seleucid administration reflected the same pragmatic synthesis that characterized their governmental approach. Seleucus participated in traditional Babylonian ceremonies, including the annual Akitu festival that renewed the king's divine mandate, while simultaneously promoting the worship of Macedonian and Greek deities. The famous cylinder of Antiochus I, discovered at Borsippa, demonstrates this religious syncretism by recording royal devotion to both Nabu, the Babylonian god of writing and wisdom, and Apollo, the patron deity of the Seleucid dynasty. Urban foundation represented perhaps the most visible manifestation of Seleucid cultural policy and administrative strategy. Unlike the Persian Empire, which had generally governed through existing cities and administrative centres, the Hellenistic kingdoms created new urban centres designed to serve as focal points for Greek culture and Macedonian military power. Seleucus proved particularly ambitious in this regard, founding dozens of cities throughout his territories and earning recognition as one of history's greatest city builders. Antioch on the Orontes, established around 300 BC, exemplified Seleucid urban planning at its most sophisticated. Located approximately 20 miles inland from the Mediterranean coast, the city occupied a strategic position that controlled access to both the Syrian interior and the sea routes connecting Egypt with Asia Minor. The site selection demonstrated careful consideration of military, economic, and political factors that would characterize Seleucid urban foundations throughout the empire. The city's layout reflected the orthogonal planning principles that had become standard in Greek urban design since the 5th century BC. Wide streets intersected at right angles, creating regular city blocks that could accommodate both residential areas and public buildings. The main thoroughfare, later known as the Colonnaded Street, stretched for nearly 2 miles and featured the covered walkways that would become characteristic of Hellenistic urban architecture. Public spaces included a massive agora surrounded by stoas, a theatre capable of seating thousands of spectators, and a gymnasium where young men received the physical and intellectual training that defined Greek education. Seleucia on the Tigris, founded around 305 BC, served different strategic purposes while reflecting similar planning principles. Located on the west bank of the Tigris River, approximately 30 miles north of Babylon, the new city was designed to serve as the administrative capital of the empire's eastern territories. Its position provided easy access to both Mesopotamian agricultural regions and the trade routes connecting Iran with the Mediterranean world. The decision to establish a new capital rather than simply occupying Babylon demonstrated Seleucus's understanding of the symbolic dimensions of imperial power. Babylon carried associations with both Persian rule and Alexander's death that complicated its use as a Seleucid centre. Seleucia on the Tigris, by contrast, represented a fresh start that could embody Seleucid values while respecting local traditions. The city's rapid growth, reaching a population of several 100,000 within a generation, testified to the success of this approach. The urban planning of Seleucia incorporated lessons learned from both Greek and Mesopotamian traditions. The city featured the regular street grid characteristic of Hellenistic foundations, but its buildings reflected adaptations to local climate and building materials. Extensive use of fired brick, a Mesopotamian specialty, created structures that could withstand the region's extreme temperatures and occasional flooding. The royal palace complex, covering several acres near the city centre, combined Macedonian architectural elements with Persian ceremonial spaces designed to impress both local populations and foreign ambassadors. Both cities served as centres for the cultural transformation that Seleucus sought to achieve throughout his empire. Greek became the language of administration, education, and high culture, while local languages continued to serve daily communication needs. The gymnasium system, transplanted from the Greek homeland, provided education for the sons of both settlers and local elites, creating a shared cultural foundation that transcended ethnic boundaries. Theatrical performances, athletic competitions, and religious festivals reinforced Greek cultural values while incorporating local elements that made them accessible to diverse populations. The economic foundations of these urban centres reflected the broader commercial strategies that would sustain the Seleucid Empire throughout its existence. Antioch's location made it a natural hub for the trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean, allowing Seleucid merchants to profit from the exchange of silk, spices, and precious stones for manufactured goods and precious metals. Seleucia on the Tigris controlled access to the agricultural wealth of Mesopotamia, while serving as a distribution point for goods moving between Iran and the Western territories. The assassination of Seleucus I Nicator in 281 BC at Lysimachia marked the end of an era and thrust his son Antiochus into a position of unprecedented responsibility. Antiochus I, who had already governed the Eastern Territories as co-ruler for nearly 2 decades, inherited an empire that stretched across 3 continents, but faced centrifugal forces that threatened to tear it apart. Unlike his father's gradual accumulation of power through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, Antiochus confronted immediate challenges that would test every aspect of Seleucid administrative and military capability. The sheer geographic scope of the Seleucid Empire presented logistical nightmares that no previous state had attempted to solve. From the Aegean islands, where Greek settlers maintained traditional polis institutions, to the Bactrian highlands, where Iranian nobles commanded feudal armies, the empire encompassed territories with fundamentally different political traditions, economic systems, and cultural expectations. A message sent from Antioch to the eastern satrapies required months to arrive, making centralized decision-making nearly impossible for urgent matters. This communication lag meant that provincial governors necessarily operated with considerable autonomy, creating opportunities for ambitious satraps to establish independent power bases. Antiochus' approach to governing this vast domain reflected lessons learned during his eastern apprenticeship under his father. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Macedonian institutions across all territories, he developed a flexible administrative system that adapted to local conditions while maintaining essential imperial prerogatives. In the Western territories, where Greek and Macedonian populations concentrated in urban centres, traditional Hellenistic governmental forms predominated. City councils elected from among the propertied classes managed local affairs, while royal officials supervised tax collection and military recruitment. The eastern provinces retained more of their Persian-era administrative structures, with Iranian nobles serving as intermediaries between the Seleucid court and local populations. The integration of Greek colonists with indigenous populations required particularly delicate handling, as cultural tensions threatened to undermine the empire's stability. Macedonian and Greek settlers generally concentrated in urban centres where they could maintain familiar social institutions and cultural practices. These communities enjoyed privileged legal status, with disputes adjudicated according to Greek law and civic life organised around traditional institutions like the gymnasium and theatre. However, their minority status in most regions made them dependent on imperial protection, creating a natural alliance between settler communities and the Seleucid monarchy. Indigenous populations retained their traditional legal systems and religious practices under Seleucid rule, but faced pressure to adopt Greek cultural forms for advancement in imperial service. Ambitious local families sent their sons to Greek-style schools, where they learned the language and customs necessary for administrative careers. This cultural hybridization created a new class of Hellenized natives who served as intermediaries between the imperial government and local communities. Cities like Seleucia on the Tigris became laboratories for this cultural synthesis, with Mesopotamian architectural techniques applied to Greek building types and local religious traditions incorporated into Hellenistic festival cycles. The military challenges facing Antiochus I were equally complex, as the empire's borders remained contested by powerful neighbours who coveted Seleucid territories. The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt had emerged from the Diadochi Wars as the Seleucids' primary rival, controlling the wealthy Nile Valley and maintaining a formidable navy that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who had assumed power in 283 BC, possessed both the resources and ambition necessary to challenge Seleucid expansion westward, while supporting rebellions within Seleucid territory. The First Syrian War, which erupted around 274 BC, established the pattern of Ptolemaic-Seleucid conflict that would persist for over a century. The immediate cause involved competing claims to Coeli Syria, the region encompassing modern Lebanon, southern Syria, and Palestine that controlled the vital trade routes connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. This territory's strategic importance extended far beyond its agricultural wealth, as control over the Levantine corridor determined which power could project force between the eastern Mediterranean and the Asian interior. Ptolemaic strategy relied heavily on naval superiority and the ability to foment rebellions within Seleucid territory. Egyptian fleets based in Cyprus and the Aegean islands could intercept Seleucid communications and supply lines while supporting local uprisings against imperial authority. The Ptolemies maintained extensive intelligence networks throughout the Seleucid Empire, providing financial support to discontented satraps and encouraging ethnic tensions that weakened central control. This indirect approach proved particularly effective in Anatolia, where the complex political geography created numerous opportunities for Egyptian interference. Antiochus I's response demonstrated the military innovations that would characterize Seleucid warfare throughout the empire's existence. Unable to match Ptolemaic naval strength, he focused on developing land forces capable of rapid deployment across vast distances. The traditional Macedonian phalanx remained the core of Seleucid armies, but Antiochus expanded its ethnic composition to include Iranian and Mesopotamian recruits trained in Greek fighting techniques. These mixed phalanxes proved remarkably effective, combining Macedonian discipline with the numerical strength necessary for extended campaigns. The integration of various ethnic military traditions created a uniquely Seleucid approach to warfare that distinguished their armies from other Hellenistic forces. Iranian horsemen brought centuries of experience in mounted archery and the tactical flexibility that had made Persian cavalry legendary throughout the ancient world. These units, organised as cataphracts with both horse and rider protected by scale armour, provided the shock capability necessary to break enemy formations. The distinctive appearance of these heavily armoured cavalrymen, with their long lances and elaborate horse armour, became synonymous with Seleucid military power. Mesopotamian military traditions contributed different but equally valuable elements to the Seleucid system. The region's ancient experience with siege warfare provided engineers skilled in constructing and operating the massive catapults and battering rams that dominated Hellenistic sieges. Babylonian mathematicians applied their sophisticated understanding of geometry and mechanics to improve the accuracy and range of artillery pieces, giving Seleucid armies advantages in both offensive and defensive siege operations. The war elephants inherited from Seleucus' treaty with Chandragupta remained the most spectacular component of Seleucid forces, though their tactical employment evolved considerably under Antiochus I. Early Hellenistic commanders had used elephants primarily as shock troops, relying on their psychological impact to break enemy formations. Antiochus developed more sophisticated tactics that integrated elephant units with cavalry and infantry formations, creating combined arms teams capable of exploiting breakthrough opportunities. Each elephant carried a crew of 4 men, a mahout who controlled the animal, 2 archers who provided covering fire, and a spearman who engaged enemy infantry at close range. The care and training of war elephants required specialised knowledge that the Seleucids acquired through continued contact with Indian kingdoms. Elephant handlers, many of whom were Indians who had accompanied the original animals westward, maintained their own communities within Seleucid territories. These mahout families passed their skills from generation to generation, creating a hereditary class of specialists whose expertise proved essential for maintaining the empire's elephant corps. The animals themselves required enormous quantities of food and water, making their deployment a major logistical undertaking that influenced campaign planning throughout Seleucid history. The most dramatic test of Antiochus I's military reforms came not from the ongoing conflict with Egypt, but from an unexpected invasion that threatened the empire's Anatolian territories. Around 278 BC, massive Celtic tribes known to the Greeks as Galatians crossed the Hellespont and began ravaging Western Asia Minor. These warriors, part of the great Celtic migrations that had terrorized Europe for generations, brought military techniques and cultural practices completely foreign to Mediterranean warfare. Their sudden appearance created panic throughout the Greek cities of the Aegean coast and threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Gallic invasion differed fundamentally from traditional conflicts between Hellenistic kingdoms, as the Celtic warriors showed little interest in territorial conquest or political accommodation. Instead, they conducted systematic raids designed to extract tribute from settled populations while avoiding decisive battles with organised armies. Their tactics emphasised mobility and psychological warfare, with warbands appearing suddenly to devastate agricultural areas before disappearing into the Anatolian interior. The Celts' reputation for ferocity, enhanced by their practice of taking heads as trophies and their apparent indifference to death in battle, demoralised local populations and made resistance seem futile. Greek cities throughout western Anatolia found themselves helpless against these raids, as their traditional military systems proved inadequate for dealing with the Celtic threat. Urban militias trained for conventional warfare could not match the mobility of Celtic warbands, while the mercenary forces that many cities employed lacked the motivation necessary for sustained campaigning against such formidable opponents. Appeals to various Hellenistic monarchs produced limited assistance, as most rulers were preoccupied with their own territorial disputes and reluctant to commit resources to distant campaigns. Antiochus III's decision to personally lead a major expedition against the Galatians reflected both the severity of the threat and his recognition that successful intervention could establish Seleucid authority throughout Anatolia. The campaign he organised around 275 BC represented the largest military operation mounted by the Seleucids since the Diadochi Wars, involving forces drawn from throughout the empire and demonstrating the logistical capabilities that would sustain Seleucid power for the next 2 centuries. The decisive battle, fought near modern Ankara, showcased the tactical innovations that Antiochus had developed during his reign. The Seleucid army deployed in a formation that maximised the advantages of their diverse military components while neutralising Celtic strengths. The phalanx occupied the centre, its 18-foot pikes creating an impenetrable barrier against Celtic charges. Cataphract cavalry protected the flanks, their heavy armour providing protection against Celtic javelins, while their lances could penetrate Celtic shields and mail. The war elephants, positioned at key points throughout the formation, served both as mobile strongpoints and psychological weapons designed to disrupt Celtic battle lines. The Celtic forces, estimated at over 40,000 warriors, initially attempted their traditional tactics of massed charges designed to break enemy formations through sheer ferocity. However, the disciplined Seleucid phalanx held firm against repeated assaults, while the cataphracts conducted flanking attacks that prevented the Celts from concentrating their forces effectively. The elephants proved particularly devastating as Celtic horses had never encountered such creatures and fled in panic, disrupting the mobility that was essential to Celtic tactics. The battle's climax came when Antiochus personally led a cavalry charge that broke the Celtic centre and transformed an orderly withdrawal into a general rout. Contemporary sources describe the king fighting in the front ranks, his purple cloak and gilded armour making him a visible symbol of Seleucid power. This personal leadership, reminiscent of Alexander's example, inspired his troops while demonstrating to both allies and enemies that the Seleucid monarchy remained capable of decisive military action. The aftermath of the victory established patterns that would characterise Seleucid policy towards defeated enemies throughout the empire's history. Rather than attempting to exterminate the Celtic tribes or drive them back across the Hellespont, Antiochus negotiated a settlement that transformed potential enemies into useful allies. The surviving Galatians, estimated at approximately 20,000 people, received grants of land in central Anatolia where they could maintain their traditional social organisation while serving as a buffer against future invasions. This settlement created the region known as Galatia, where Celtic tribes maintained their distinctive culture for centuries while gradually adopting Greek and Anatolian influences. The Galatians retained their traditional warrior culture and tribal organisation, but their military service to the Seleucid crown provided them with regular income and access to Mediterranean trade networks. Their reputation as fierce fighters made them valuable mercenaries throughout the Hellenistic world, while their loyalty to the Seleucids was secured through the land grants that had saved them from destruction. The establishment of Seleucid authority in Anatolia following the Gallic victory required careful diplomatic management of the region's complex political landscape. The Greek cities of the Aegean coast had traditionally maintained independence through leagues and alliances that balanced competing external pressures. Antiochus's intervention against the Galatians provided him with the prestige necessary to establish Seleucid hegemony over these communities, but he needed to respect their autonomy sufficiently to maintain their cooperation. The solution involved a flexible system of alliances and protectorates that acknowledged local political traditions while ensuring Seleucid strategic interests. Major cities like Ephesus and Miletus retained their internal autonomy and democratic institutions while accepting Seleucid garrisons and contributing to imperial military campaigns. Smaller communities received protection in exchange for tribute payments and military service. creating a network of dependencies that extended Seleucid influence throughout western Anatolia without requiring direct administration of every territory. The death of Seleucus III. Ceraunus, in 223 BC, during a disastrous campaign in Anatolia, thrust his 18-year-old brother Antiochus onto the throne at a moment when the Seleucid Empire teetered on the brink of dissolution. The young king, later known as Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great, inherited territories ravaged by rebellions, provincial governors asserting independence, and external enemies pressing against every frontier. The empire his great-great-grandfather had forged through military genius and diplomatic skill had shrunk to barely half its original size, with vast regions from Bactria to Anatolia, either in open revolt or effectively autonomous under local strongmen. The immediate challenges facing the new monarch would have daunted a ruler twice his age and experience. In the east, the Parthian Arsaces II had consolidated control over the Iranian plateau and was systematically absorbing former Seleucid territories, while the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, under Diodotus II, had established complete independence beyond the Hindu Kush. Closer to the imperial heartland, the satrap Molon controlled Mesopotamia and had proclaimed himself king, commanding the loyalty of troops who'd served his family for generations. In Anatolia, Achaeus, the king's own cousin and former regent, had assumed royal titles and controlled most of Asia Minor through a network of alliances with local dynasts and Greek cities. The young Antiochus possessed neither the military reputation that had sustained his predecessors, nor the financial resources necessary to mount simultaneous campaigns against multiple enemies. The royal treasury, depleted by decades of warfare and territorial losses, could barely maintain the court at Antioch, let alone finance the massive expeditions required to restore imperial authority. Many contemporary observers expected the Seleucid Empire to fragment completely, with various regional powers dividing its territories among themselves, while the last remnants of Alexander's eastern conquests disappeared into history. Yet Antiochus III would transform this desperate situation into the foundation for the most spectacular military achievements in Seleucid history. His reign marked the empire's final golden age, a period when Seleucid armies once again marched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and Seleucid diplomats negotiated as equals with Rome and Egypt. This remarkable recovery began with the systematic reconquest of rebellious territories, continued with the famous Eastern campaigns that restored Seleucid authority across the Iranian world, and culminated in the expansion into Europe that would ultimately bring the empire into fatal conflict with Roman power. The first phase of Antiochus's restoration focused on eliminating the immediate threats to imperial survival posed by the rebellions of Molon and Achaeus. The Mesopotamian revolt presented the more urgent danger, as Molon's control of Babylonia and Susiana deprived the crown of its most reliable revenue sources, while providing the rebel with resources sufficient to maintain large armies. Molon had served as satrap of Media under Seleucus III and commanded the respect of Iranian nobles who viewed him as a legitimate alternative to a young king they considered weak and inexperienced. His proclamation of royal status represented more than mere opportunism. It reflected genuine grievances about the empire's increasingly Greek character and the marginalization of Iranian military traditions. The campaign against Molon in 221 BC demonstrated the military and political skills that would characterize Antiochus's entire reign. Rather than rushing eastward with whatever forces he could hastily assemble, the king spent months carefully preparing an expedition that would definitively resolve the Mesopotamian crisis. He negotiated agreements with various Anatolian dynasts to secure his western frontiers, borrowed heavily from the temple treasuries at Antioch and other Syrian cities, and assembled a diverse army that reflected the multi-ethnic character of his empire. The royal forces included traditional Macedonian phalanxes recruited from the military colonies established by earlier Seleucid kings, Iranian cavalry units whose loyalty had been secured through generous land grants, and Arab auxiliaries whose knowledge of desert warfare would prove invaluable in the coming campaigns, the decisive encounter occurred near the ancient city of Apollonia on the Tigris, where Molon had concentrated his forces in a strong defensive position that commanded the river crossing. The rebel army, estimated at nearly 50,000 men, consisted primarily of Iranian troops whose families had served the Seleucid crown for generations, but who had transferred their allegiance to Molon out of frustration with royal policies they perceived as favouring Greek interests over Iranian traditions. These soldiers fought with the same weapons and tactics that had made Seleucid armies formidable throughout the Hellenistic world, creating a civil war between forces that were mirror images of each other. Antiochus's victory resulted not from superior equipment or tactics, but from his personal leadership and political acumen. On the morning of battle, the young king rode along his battle lines without helmet or armour, speaking directly to Iranian soldiers who formed the majority of both armies. His fluent Persian and detailed knowledge of Iranian military customs, acquired during his education in the Eastern Territories, convinced many of Molon's supporters that he represented continuity with Seleucid traditions, rather than a break from them. When the battle began, entire units from Molon's army changed sides, transforming what might have been a costly victory into a complete rout that ended with the rebels' suicide and the submission of his remaining followers. The suppression of Aegean's revolt in Anatolia required different tactics, as the rebel controlled numerous fortified cities whose Greek populations viewed him as a protector against barbarian invasions rather than a usurper. Aegean had skillfully exploited ethnic tensions between Greek settlers and indigenous Anatolian peoples, presenting himself as the defender of Hellenic civilization against the empire's increasingly oriental character. His control of the Aegean ports provided him with access to Egyptian gold and mercenary forces, while his marriage connections with local dynasts created a network of alliances that extended throughout western Anatolia. The siege of Sardis in 214 BC, where Aegean had established his capital, showcased the sophisticated siege techniques that Seleucid engineers had developed through decades of warfare against fortified positions. The city occupied a naturally strong position on a steep hill overlooking the Hermus River Valley, with walls that had been strengthened using the latest developments in defensive architecture. Aegean commanded a garrison of approximately 10,000 men, including veteran mercenaries and local militia units, whose knowledge of the terrain made direct assault extremely costly. Antiochus's approach combined traditional siege methods with innovative tactics designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of Sardis. His engineers constructed elaborate earthworks that allowed siege engines to approach the city walls despite the difficult terrain, while specialized mining units tunneled beneath the fortifications to create breaches that infantry could exploit. The siege lasted nearly 2 years, during which both sides employed increasingly sophisticated techniques that pushed contemporary military technology to its limits. The fall of Sardis resulted from a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering that demonstrated Antiochus's growing mastery of both warfare and diplomacy. Secret negotiations with key figures within the city eventually produced a conspiracy that opened the gates to royal forces, allowing them to capture Aegean alive and end the rebellion without the massive casualties that a direct assault would have entailed. The rebels' execution, carried out with the elaborate ceremonial that befitted a member of the royal family, sent a clear message about the consequences of challenging imperial authority, while demonstrating Antiochus's willingness to show mercy to those who submitted voluntarily. With the western and central territories secured, Antiochus could finally address the larger strategic challenge posed by the loss of the empire's eastern provinces. The Iranian plateau and Central Asian territories that had been integral parts of the Seleucid Empire since its foundation now lay under the control of independent rulers who had systematically expanded their domains at imperial expense. The Parthian kingdom, established by the Arsacid dynasty around 247 BC, controlled the vital trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Central Asia and had begun expanding westward toward the traditional Seleucid heartland. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, founded by Diodotus I around 250 BC, dominated the wealthy agricultural regions beyond the Hindu Kush and maintained diplomatic relations with Indian kingdoms that had once acknowledged Seleucid suzerainty. The decision to launch a major eastern expedition represented both strategic necessity and personal ambition for Antiochus III. The loss of these territories had deprived the empire of enormous revenues from trade taxes and agricultural production, while their independence encouraged other provincial governors to assert greater autonomy. More importantly, the existence of successful breakaway kingdoms challenged the fundamental legitimacy of Seleucid rule by demonstrating that former imperial territories could prosper under local leadership. A successful reconquest would not only restore lost revenues, but also re-establish the empire's prestige throughout the Hellenistic world. The Eastern campaigns, which Antiochus launched in 212 BC, and which contemporary sources termed his anabasis in conscious imitation of Alexander's conquests, represented the largest military undertaking in Seleucid history since the Diadochi Wars. The expedition required unprecedented logistical preparation, as the king needed to transport and supply a massive army across thousands of miles of difficult terrain while maintaining communications with the Western territories. The royal forces eventually assembled for the campaign included approximately 100,000 men drawn from throughout the empire, along with siege engines, supply trains, and the administrative apparatus necessary to govern reconquered territories. The army's composition reflected the multi-ethnic character that had become characteristic of Seleucid military forces under Antiochus III. The corps consisted of Macedonian phalanxes recruited from the military colonies that earlier kings had established throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. These settlements, originally founded to provide reliable military manpower while spreading Greek culture, had evolved into hereditary military castes whose members received land grants in exchange for military service. Their descendants retained the fighting skills and unit cohesion that had made Macedonian infantry legendary, while their permanent residence in the east gave them familiarity with local conditions that proved invaluable during extended campaigns. Iranian cavalry units formed another crucial component of the expedition, providing the mobility and striking power necessary for warfare across the vast distances of Central Asia. These horsemen, recruited from noble families throughout the Iranian territories, brought centuries of experience in mounted warfare that complemented the disciplined infantry tactics of the phalanx. Their equipment combined traditional Persian elements with Hellenistic innovations, creating a distinctive military culture that synthesized Eastern and Western traditions. The cataphract units, with both horses and riders protected by scale armour, could deliver devastating charges against enemy formations, while lighter cavalry provided reconnaissance and harassment capabilities essential for campaign success. The expedition's advance into Parthian territory in 209 BC encountered determined resistance from Arsaces III, who had assembled a confederation of Iranian tribes united by their opposition to Seleucid restoration. The Parthian military system, based on the traditional Iranian emphasis on cavalry warfare, presented tactical challenges that differed significantly from the conventional armies that Antiochus had faced in his earlier campaigns. Parthian forces avoided direct confrontation with the Seleucid phalanx, instead employing hit-and-run tactics that exploited their superior mobility to harass supply lines and isolated detachments. The decisive encounter occurred near Hekatompilos, the Parthian capital where Arsaces finally accepted battle in defence of his kingdom's heartland. The Parthian army, estimated at approximately 40,000 men, consisted primarily of mounted archers, whose tactics had been refined through decades of warfare against both settled populations and nomadic tribes. These horsemen could maintain devastating arrow storms while remaining beyond the reach of infantry weapons, a capability that had made them formidable opponents for previous Seleucid expeditions. Antiochus's victory resulted from tactical innovations that neutralized Parthian advantages while exploiting the strengths of his own diverse forces. He deployed his phalanx in a defensive formation that could absorb Parthian arrow attacks while his own archers and artillery provided counter-battery fire. The cataphract cavalry, held in reserve until the crucial moment, delivered a coordinated charge that broke the Parthian line and transformed an archery duel into a conventional battle where Seleucid advantages in armour and discipline proved decisive. The defeat forced Arsaces to acknowledge Seleucid suzerainty while retaining local autonomy, a compromise that restored imperial prestige without requiring permanent occupation of Parthian territory. The campaign against the Greco-Bactrian kingdom presented different challenges, as King Euthydemus commanded forces trained in Macedonian tactics similar to those employed by the Seleucids themselves. The Bactrian army included phalanx units recruited from Greek military colonies, Iranian cavalry formations, and Indian auxiliaries whose war elephants had been acquired through trade with the Mauryan Empire. This diverse force, numbering approximately 30,000 men, occupied strong defensive positions in the mountainous terrain that protected the approaches to Bactra, the kingdom's capital. The siege of Bactra, which lasted nearly 3 years, became a test of endurance that pushed both armies to their limits. The city's position in a fertile oasis surrounded by desert made it nearly impregnable to direct assault, while its extensive fortifications incorporated the latest developments in defensive architecture. Euthydemus had stockpiled supplies sufficient for an extended siege and maintained communication with potential allies throughout Central Asia and India, who might provide relief forces. Antiochus's eventual success resulted from a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation that reflected his growing sophistication as both commander and statesman. Rather than attempting to storm the city's formidable defences, he established a complete blockade that gradually weakened the garrison while his engineers conducted systematic siege operations designed to breach the walls. Simultaneously, he opened negotiations with Euthydemus that eventually produced a treaty recognizing Bactrian autonomy under Seleucid suzerainty, similar to the arrangement he had negotiated with the Parthians. The eastern campaigns concluded with Antiochus's advance to the Indus River, where he renewed the treaty relationships that Seleucus I had established with Indian kingdoms 2 generations earlier. The agreement with the Mauryan Empire, now ruled by successors of Chandragupta, confirmed Seleucid claims to tribute and diplomatic precedence, while acknowledging Indian control over territories beyond the traditional imperial frontier. This arrangement provided Antiochus with additional war elephants and access to Indian luxury goods that enhanced his prestige throughout the Hellenistic world. The return to Antioch in 205 BC marked the culmination of the most successful military campaign in Seleucid history since the empire's foundation. Antiochus had restored imperial authority over territories that had been independent for nearly half a century, while demonstrating that Seleucid power could still project itself across the vast distances that separated the Mediterranean from Central Asia. The wealth acquired through renewed tribute payments and restored trade routes provided the financial foundation for the ambitious Western campaigns that would follow, while the military reputation earned through these victories established Antiochus as the most formidable ruler in the contemporary world. The transformation of the Seleucid Empire's strategic position following the Eastern campaigns created new opportunities for expansion that Antiochus was quick to exploit. The restoration of imperial authority over the Iranian territories had eliminated the most serious internal threats to Seleucid power, while providing access to the military and financial resources necessary for major campaigns against external enemies. The tribute payments from restored territories, combined with renewed control over the lucrative trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean, had replenished the royal treasury and made possible military expenditures on a scale not seen since the early Diadochi Wars. The Fourth Syrian War, which erupted in 219 BC while Antiochus was still engaged in his eastern campaigns, had demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers inherent in the empire's restored position. Ptolemy IV Philopator, who had assumed power in Egypt following his father's death in 221 BC, had initially appeared to offer little threat to Seleucid interests. The new Ptolemaic king was widely regarded as weak and pleasure-loving, more interested in court ceremonies and religious festivals than in the aggressive foreign policy that had characterized his predecessors. His apparent weakness encouraged Antiochus to launch a preemptive strike designed to secure Coelus Syria before completing his eastern campaigns. The initial Seleucid campaign in Coelus Syria had achieved remarkable success, with Antiochus III's forces capturing most of the disputed territory and advancing to within striking distance of Egypt proper. The Battle of Panium in 200 BC had shattered Ptolemaic resistance and established Seleucid control over the vital trade routes connecting Egypt with Asia. Yet, this triumph, which seemed to restore the empire to its greatest territorial extent since the early Diadochi Wars, would ultimately precipitate the confrontation that marked the beginning of Seleucid decline. Rome, emerging victorious from its Second Punic War against Hannibal, now possessed both the military capability and strategic interest to intervene decisively in eastern Mediterranean affairs. The Roman Republic's expansion into Greek affairs had proceeded gradually throughout the 3rd century BC, beginning with interventions across the Adriatic that were ostensibly defensive but increasingly revealed broader ambitions. The First Macedonian War against Philip V had established Roman influence in the Balkans, while diplomatic relationships with various Greek cities and leagues provided pretexts for future involvement. Roman senators, many of whom had received Greek educations and understood Hellenistic political dynamics, recognized that the eastern Mediterranean's wealth and strategic position made it too valuable to remain under the control of potentially hostile monarchies. Antiochus III's decision to expand into Europe represented both the logical culmination of his victorious campaigns and a fundamental miscalculation of the changing strategic environment. The king's forces had restored Seleucid authority across the Iranian world, secured control over Coeli Syria, and demonstrated their capability to project power across vast distances. The Thracian territories that had once belonged to Lysimachus appeared to offer natural targets for further expansion, while the Greek cities of the Aegean coast provided potential allies who might welcome liberation from Macedonian or local tyrannies. The crossing of the Hellespont in 196 BC with an army of approximately 60,000 men marked Antiochus's entry into the European political system that Rome increasingly dominated. The Seleucid forces that established themselves in Thrace represented the most formidable eastern army that had appeared in Europe since Alexander's successors had fought their great battles 2 centuries earlier. The king's phalanxes, hardened by years of campaigning from Mesopotamia to Bactria, possessed a level of experience and cohesion that surpassed most contemporary military forces. Their equipment reflected the technological innovations that had emerged from decades of Hellenistic warfare, with improved armour, weapons and siege engines that incorporated lessons learned from conflicts across the known world. The Seleucid military system that Antiochus deployed in his European campaigns had evolved considerably from the traditional Macedonian model inherited from Alexander's conquests. The core phalanx units, while maintaining their characteristic 18-foot sarissas and bronze shields, now included significant numbers of Iranian and Syrian recruits whose training had adapted Macedonian techniques to different physical characteristics and cultural backgrounds. These mixed formations proved remarkably effective, combining the disciplined cohesion of traditional Macedonian infantry with the numerical strength necessary for extended campaigns across hostile territory. The cataphract cavalry that accompanied the phalanx represented perhaps the most distinctive element of Antiochus's military forces, reflecting the synthesis of Eastern and Western military traditions that characterized mature Seleucid armies. These heavily armoured horsemen, with both riders and mounts protected by scale armour that covered them from head to foot, could deliver devastating charges against enemy formations while possessing the defensive capability to withdraw and regroup for subsequent attacks. Their long lances, designed specifically for mounted combat, could penetrate most contemporary armour at close range, while their training emphasised the coordinated manoeuvres necessary for effective cavalry operations. The war elephants that had become synonymous with Seleucid military power since the treaty with Chandragupta accompanied Antiochus's European expedition, though their effectiveness in the different climatic and tactical conditions of the Balkans remained uncertain. The king commanded approximately 50 of these animals, each carrying a crew of 4 men armed with javelins, bows and long spears designed for close combat. The psychological impact of these creatures on European populations who had never encountered them provided significant advantages in siege warfare and diplomatic negotiations, while their ability to break through fortified positions made them valuable assets for reducing enemy strongholds. Roman intelligence regarding Seleucid military capabilities had improved significantly since the Republic's first encounters with Hellenistic armies during the Pyrrhic War 70 years earlier. Roman commanders understood the tactical principles underlying phalanx warfare and had developed countermeasures designed to exploit the formation's inherent vulnerabilities. The manipular system that had evolved through centuries of Italian warfare provided Roman legions with greater tactical flexibility than traditional phalanx formations, while Roman engineering capabilities had reached levels that matched or exceeded those of their Hellenistic opponents. The diplomatic manoeuvring that preceded open warfare revealed the fundamental differences between Roman and Seleucid approaches to international relations. Antiochus operated within the traditional Hellenistic framework that recognized spheres of influence and accepted the legitimacy of monarchical expansion into territories that lacked effective protection. His negotiations with various Greek cities and his support for anti-Roman factions throughout the eastern Mediterranean reflected conventional diplomatic practices that had governed relations between Hellenistic kingdoms for generations. Roman diplomacy, by contrast, increasingly reflected the Republic's unique political structure and its growing confidence in military superiority. Roman negotiators demanded not merely the resolution of specific territorial disputes, but the acceptance of Roman hegemony throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The terms they proposed to Antiochus essentially required him to abandon all territories west of the Taurus Mountains, and to acknowledge Roman authority over Greek affairs, conditions that no self-respecting Hellenistic monarch could accept without destroying his own legitimacy. The outbreak of hostilities in 192 BC began with relatively minor engagements that failed to reveal the true scale of the conflict that would follow. Antiochus's initial operations focused on securing his European base by capturing key fortresses and establishing alliances with Greek cities that opposed Roman influence. His forces achieved several early successes, including the capture of Chalcis and the establishment of friendly governments in various Euboean cities. These victories, while tactically significant, failed to produce the general Greek uprising against Roman authority that Seleucid strategists had anticipated. The Roman response demonstrated the Republic's evolved capacity for large-scale military operations beyond the Italian peninsula. The consul Manius Acilius Glabrio assembled an army of approximately 40,000 men, including 2 veteran legions that had served in the recent wars against Philip V of Macedon. This force possessed extensive experience in fighting Hellenistic armies and had been specifically trained in tactics designed to counter phalanx formations and cavalry charges. The inclusion of allied contingents from throughout the Roman Confederation provided additional manpower while demonstrating the breadth of support that Roman policies commanded among Italian communities. The Battle of Thermopylae in 191 BC provided the first major test of Seleucid military capabilities against Roman legions in a conventional engagement. Antiochus had selected this historically significant position with careful attention to its tactical advantages, as the narrow pass between mountains and sea appeared to neutralize Roman numerical superiority while maximizing the effectiveness of his own disciplined formations. The defensive works that his engineers constructed across the pass incorporated lessons learned from centuries of siege warfare, with earthworks and palisades designed to channel Roman attacks into killing zones where Seleucid archers and artillery could inflict maximum casualties. The Seleucid deployment reflected Antiochus's understanding of both the terrain's opportunities and his army's capabilities. The phalanx occupied the centre of the line, its front rank protected by a continuous wall of 18-foot pikes that created an impenetrable barrier against frontal assault. Cataphract cavalry units covered the flanks where the terrain permitted mounted operations, while lighter cavalry and infantry occupied the heights on either side of the pass. The war elephants, positioned at crucial points throughout the formation, served both as mobile strongpoints and psychological weapons designed to disrupt Roman battle formations. The Roman assault began at dawn with a coordinated attack that demonstrated the tactical sophistication that had made the legions masters of Mediterranean warfare. Rather than attempting direct frontal attacks against the phalanx, Glabrio deployed his forces in a complex maneuver designed to exploit the defensive position's inherent weaknesses. While the main body of legions engaged the Seleucid centre, specialised units moved through the mountains to outflank the defensive line and attack from unexpected directions. The battle's turning point came when Roman forces, guided by local Greeks familiar with mountain paths, appeared on the heights behind the Seleucid position and began attacking the defenders from the rear. This manoeuvre, reminiscent of the Persian strategy that had defeated Leonidas at the same location 3 centuries earlier, created panic among Seleucid troops who found themselves trapped between converging Roman attacks. The disciplined phalanx formation, so effective against frontal assault, proved vulnerable to attacks from multiple directions that prevented coordinated defensive responses. Antiochus's personal conduct during the battle demonstrated both courage and tactical awareness, as he led cavalry charges designed to break the Roman encirclement and allow his infantry to withdraw in good order. Contemporary accounts describe the king fighting in the front ranks, his gilded armour and purple cloak making him a conspicuous target for Roman missiles. His horse was killed beneath him during one charge, and he received several wounds that would have proven fatal to a less well-protected warrior. The king's survival and successful extraction of approximately half his army prevented the defeat from becoming a complete disaster, but the psychological impact of losing such a historically significant position severely damaged Seleucid prestige throughout the Greek world. The retreat from Thermopylae forced Antiochus to abandon his European ambitions and concentrate his remaining forces in Asia Minor, where he hoped to exploit familiar terrain and reliable supply lines to achieve better results against Roman pursuit. The king's strategic position had deteriorated significantly, as his defeat had encouraged previously neutral Greek cities to declare for Rome while discouraging potential allies who might have provided crucial support. The financial costs of maintaining large armies in hostile territory were depleting the royal treasury, while communications with the empire's eastern territories had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Roman pursuit of the defeated Seleucid forces demonstrated the Republic's commitment to achieving decisive results, rather than merely driving enemies from contested territories. The consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of the famous Scipio Africanus, assumed command of Roman operations and began preparations for an invasion of Asia Minor that would carry the war into Seleucid heartland territories. This decision reflected both Roman confidence in military superiority and recognition that incomplete victories often led to renewed conflicts that required additional campaigns to resolve definitively. The naval dimension of the war proved equally crucial to its ultimate outcome, as control of the Aegean Sea determined which side could maintain reliable communications and supply lines between Europe and Asia. The Seleucid navy, while formidable by Hellenistic standards, faced the combined fleets of Rome and its Greek allies, including the experienced Rhodian squadrons whose sailors possessed generations of experience in eastern Mediterranean waters. The technological and tactical innovations that had characterized Hellenistic naval warfare for 2 centuries would be tested against Roman engineering capabilities and the Republic's growing mastery of amphibious operations. The Battle of Meonissus in 190 BC established Roman naval supremacy in the Aegean and effectively sealed Antiochus's fate by cutting his remaining forces off from potential reinforcements and supplies from the Syrian heartland. The engagement began when the Seleucid fleet, commanded by the experienced Admiral Polixenedas, attempted to break the Roman blockade of the Hellespont and restore communications between the king's Asian and European territories. The Seleucid squadron included approximately 80 warships of various sizes, from massive desers carrying siege engines and hundreds of marines to swift triremes designed for reconnaissance and harassment operations. The Roman fleet that intercepted this breakout attempt represented the Republic's evolved naval capabilities, incorporating lessons learned from decades of warfare against Carthaginian and Illyrian opponents. Roman ships emphasized boarding tactics over ramming maneuvers, with specially trained marines equipped for close combat and grappling equipment designed to prevent enemy vessels from disengaging once contact had been established. The inclusion of allied squadrons, particularly the Rhodian contingent commanded by experienced officers who understood local weather patterns and currents, provided crucial advantages in navigation and tactical coordination. The battle's outcome demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman tactical innovations against traditional Hellenistic naval methods. Seleucid ships, designed for the ramming attacks that had dominated Mediterranean naval warfare since the 5th century BC, found themselves unable to exploit their superior speed and maneuverability against Roman vessels that sought close contact and hand-to-hand combat. The boarding tactics that Roman marines had perfected during their conflicts with Mediterranean pirates proved devastatingly effective against Hellenistic crews who lacked comparable training in shipboard combat. Polixenidas's flagship, a massive octerus that served as the Seleucid fleet's command centre, became the focus of the engagement's climactic phase when multiple Roman vessels surrounded it and launched coordinated boarding attacks. The ship's high sides and elaborate superstructure designed to provide advantages in traditional naval combat became liabilities when Roman marines used grappling hooks and boarding bridges to establish footholds on its deck. The admiral's death during the desperate fighting that followed eliminated effective Seleucid command and control, transforming an organised retreat into a general rout that cost the king most of his remaining naval forces. The destruction of Seleucid naval power opened Asia Minor to Roman invasion and forced Antiochus to concentrate his remaining military resources for a final decisive engagement that would determine the war's outcome. The king's strategic options had been severely limited by his previous defeats, as the loss of European territories and naval supremacy prevented him from conducting the kind of strategic withdrawal that had characterized his successful eastern campaigns. Instead, he needed to defend the approaches to Syria and Mesopotamia against Roman forces that possessed both numerical superiority and demonstrated tactical advantages over traditional Hellenistic military methods. The Battle of Magnesia, in 190 BC, represented the culmination of the Roman-Seleucid War, and would prove to be one of the most decisive engagements in ancient military history. Antiochus assembled the largest army of his reign for this final confrontation, drawing upon military resources from throughout his empire to create a force that exceeded 70,000 men and represented the full diversity of Seleucid military traditions. The royal army that deployed on the plains near Magnesia included not only the traditional phalanx units and cataphract cavalry that had carried Seleucid arms to victory across 3 continents, but also specialised troops whose equipment and tactics reflected the empire's vast geographic and cultural scope. The Seleucid battle line stretched for nearly 2 miles across the Lydian countryside, its formation designed to maximise the advantages of each military component, while presenting Roman attackers with tactical challenges that had proven effective in previous Hellenistic conflicts. The centre consisted of 16,000 phalangites arranged in the traditional formation, with their 18-foot pikes creating an impenetrable wall of bronze and steel. These troops, many of whom were veterans of the Eastern campaigns, possessed the experience and unit cohesion that had made Macedonian infantry legendary throughout the ancient world. Their equipment included the latest innovations in armour and weapons, with bronze cuirasses reinforced with iron plates and helmets designed to provide maximum protection while maintaining visibility and mobility. The flanking cavalry consisted of 12,000 cataphracts, drawn from the Iranian noble families who had served the Seleucid crown for generations, their scale armour gleaming in the morning sun as they formed up in perfect squadrons. Beyond them, Antiochus had positioned his war elephants, 54 massive beasts from his Indian allies, each carrying a crew of 4 armed with javelins and long spears. The sight of this assembled host, with its forest of pikes, armoured cavalry and exotic war animals, represented the culmination of 3 centuries of Hellenistic military evolution and the last great expression of Alexander's imperial legacy. The Roman army that faced this spectacular array numbered approximately 30,000 legionaries, supported by an equal number of allied troops, yet their formation appeared almost modest compared to the elaborate Seleucid deployment. The consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio had arranged his forces in the traditional triplex aces formation that had proven effective against Hellenistic opponents, with Hastati in the front ranks, Principes in the centre, and Triorii forming the reserve. The manipular system that governed Roman tactical organisation provided flexibility that phalanx formations could not match, allowing individual units to adapt to changing battlefield conditions without requiring complex redeployment of entire formations. The engagement began with the traditional exchange of missiles between light troops, but quickly escalated into the decisive cavalry action that would determine the battle's outcome. Antiochus personally led the right-wing cataphracts in a massive charge that initially achieved spectacular success, breaking through Roman cavalry formations and pursuing fleeing enemies toward the Roman camp. The king's personal courage and tactical skill were evident as he rallied scattered squadrons and maintained pressure on the Roman flank, but his absence from the main battle line would prove crucial to the engagement's final outcome. While Antiochus achieved local success on the right, the centre of his army faced the disciplined advance of Roman legions, whose tactical superiority over phalanx formations had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Seleucid phalangites, despite their experience and equipment advantages, found themselves unable to respond effectively to the flexible Roman assault that attacked their formation from multiple angles simultaneously. The rigid pike formation that had dominated ancient battlefields for centuries proved vulnerable to the manipular tactics that allowed Roman units to exploit gaps and weak points in enemy lines. The war elephants positioned at key points throughout the Seleucid formation initially created panic among Roman ranks unaccustomed to these massive creatures. However, Roman tactical innovations quickly neutralized their effectiveness as specialized velites armed with javelins targeted the mahouts who controlled each animal. Once their handlers were killed or wounded, the elephants became uncontrollable and often turned back into their own formations, trampling Seleucid infantry and creating gaps that Roman manipules could exploit. The sight of these magnificent beasts, many wounded and maddened by pain charging through their own ranks, became a symbol of the Seleucid collapse that followed. The destruction of the Seleucid centre proceeded with devastating speed once Roman legions penetrated the phalanx formation and engaged in the close combat where their training and equipment provided decisive advantages. The gladius, the Roman short sword designed for thrusting attacks, proved far more effective than the long pikes that became useless once enemy forces closed to intimate range. Seleucid casualties mounted rapidly as entire phalanx units found themselves surrounded and unable to maintain the coordinated formation that was essential for their survival. Antiochus returned from his successful cavalry pursuit to find his army in complete collapse, with Roman forces systematically destroying formations that had taken years to train and equip. The king's attempts to rally his remaining troops proved futile as panic spread throughout the Seleucid ranks and organised resistance crumbled. The battle's aftermath revealed the scale of the disaster. Seleucid losses exceeded 50,000 men, including most of the empire's veteran phalangites and cataphract cavalry, while Roman casualties numbered fewer than 400. This catastrophic defeat effectively ended Seleucid military power and forced Antiochus to accept whatever terms Rome chose to impose. The Treaty of Apamea, negotiated in 188 BC, dismantled the Seleucid Empire as a great power and established Roman hegemony throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The terms imposed by Roman negotiators reflected both the Republic's strategic objectives and its determination to prevent any revival of Seleucid military capabilities. Antiochus was required to abandon all territories west of the Taurus Mountains, effectively surrendering Asia Minor and reducing his empire to Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Iranian territories. The massive indemnity of 15,000 talents, to be paid over 12 years, would drain the royal treasury and prevent the reconstruction of military forces capable of challenging Roman authority. The treaty's military clauses proved equally devastating to Seleucid power. The Royal Navy was limited to 10 ships, none larger than a trireme, while the army was restricted to specific numbers that prevented the maintenance of forces sufficient for major campaigns. The prohibition on war elephants eliminated one of the most distinctive elements of Seleucid military capability, while restrictions on recruiting mercenaries limited the king's ability to supplement his reduced forces. These provisions transformed the Seleucids from a great power capable of projecting force across 3 continents into a regional kingdom, whose survival depended on Roman tolerance. The death of Antiochus III in 187 BC while attempting to plunder a temple in Elam marked the end of the last great Seleucid monarch and the beginning of a period of dynastic instability that would characterize the empire's remaining history. His son, Seleucus IV Philopator, inherited a kingdom burdened by crushing debt payments to Rome and facing rebellions throughout territories that had once formed the empire's secure core. The new king's reign, lasting from 187 to 175 BC, was dominated by desperate attempts to raise the funds necessary to meet Roman demands while maintaining sufficient military forces to suppress internal revolts. The assassination of Seleucus IV in 175 BC brought his brother Antiochus IV Epiphanes to the throne at a moment when the empire faced its most severe internal crisis since the rebellions that had confronted Antiochus III in his youth. The new king, who'd spent years as a hostage in Rome and possessed intimate knowledge of Roman political methods, believed that only radical reforms could restore Seleucid power and enable the empire to eventually challenge Roman hegemony. His policies, however, would provoke the most serious religious uprising in Seleucid history and demonstrate the limits of royal authority when it conflicted with deeply held religious convictions. Antiochus IV's character had been shaped by his Roman captivity, during which he had observed the Republic's political institutions and military methods, while developing a profound resentment of the constraints imposed on his family's power. Contemporary sources describe him as intelligent but erratic, capable of brilliant strategic insights, but prone to sudden decisions that ignored practical limitations. His nickname Epimanes, used by his enemies instead of his chosen title Epiphanes, reflected widespread perception of his unpredictable behaviour and grandiose ambitions that seemed disconnected from the empire's reduced circumstances. The king's Hellenization policies represented a systematic attempt to create cultural unity throughout the empire's remaining territories by promoting Greek customs, religious practices, and political institutions. This program went far beyond the voluntary cultural exchange that had characterized earlier Seleucid policy, instead employing royal authority to enforce conformity with Greek standards in areas that had previously been left to local discretion. The establishment of gymnasia in major cities, the promotion of Greek education, and the encouragement of Greek religious festivals were designed to create a unified Hellenistic culture that would strengthen imperial cohesion while reducing the influence of local traditions that might support separatist movements. The Sixth Syrian War erupted in 170 BC when Antiochus IV invaded Egypt to exploit the dynastic disputes following Ptolemy VI's succession. The king's initial success in capturing Memphis and establishing control over most of Lower Egypt appeared to restore Seleucid power to levels not seen since the reign of Antiochus III. However, this triumph proved illusory when Roman intervention forced a humiliating withdrawal that demonstrated the limits of Seleucid independence and the reality of Roman hegemony throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Roman ultimatum delivered by Gaius Popilius Laenas at Eleusis became legendary for its dramatic demonstration of Roman authority over Hellenistic monarchs. The Roman senator's famous gesture of drawing a circle in the sand around Antiochus IV and demanding an immediate decision about withdrawal from Egypt showed that the Seleucid Empire had become a Roman client state, whose foreign policy required Roman approval. The king's submission to this humiliation, witnessed by his own officers and Egyptian officials, severely damaged his prestige and encouraged rebellions throughout territories that had previously remained loyal to Seleucid authority. The humiliation at Eleusis marked a turning point in Seleucid fortunes that would reverberate throughout the empire's remaining territories for the next generation. Antiochus IV's forced withdrawal from Egypt not only demonstrated the reality of Roman supremacy, but also exposed the fundamental weakness of an empire that could no longer project power beyond its core territories without foreign permission. The psychological impact of this submission proved devastating to imperial prestige, as provincial governors and local dynasts throughout the empire began to question whether continued loyalty to the Seleucid crown served their interests better than accommodation with Rome or outright independence. The king's death in 164 BC, while campaigning in the eastern territories, created an immediate succession crisis that would plague the empire for the remainder of its existence. Antiochus IV left behind a 9-year-old son, Antiochus the Eupator, whose minority required a regency that inevitably became a source of factional conflict among competing court officials and military commanders. The boy's guardian, Lysias, possessed extensive administrative experience but lacked the military reputation necessary to command respect from provincial governors, who had grown accustomed to considerable autonomy during the previous king's frequent absences on campaign. The emergence of Alexander Ballas as a rival claimant to the Seleucid throne in 152 BC introduced a new dimension to the empire's internal struggles that would fundamentally alter the nature of royal authority. Ballas, who claimed to be the son of Antiochus IV, appeared in Rome with documentation that purported to establish his legitimacy, though most contemporary observers suspected that he was an impostor sponsored by enemies of the reigning dynasty. His Roman backing provided him with financial resources and diplomatic recognition that enabled him to mount a serious challenge to Demetrius the Soter, who had assumed power in 162 BC after eliminating the young Eupator and his regent. The civil war that erupted between Demetrius II and Alexander Ballas revealed the extent to which the Seleucid Empire had fragmented into competing power centres whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. Provincial governors throughout Syria and Mesopotamia found themselves forced to choose between rival claimants, with their decisions often determined more by calculations of personal advantage than by considerations of dynastic legitimacy or imperial unity. The traditional bonds of loyalty that had once held the empire together had been weakened by decades of military defeats, financial crises, and royal policies that had alienated important constituencies throughout the realm. Demetrius's attempts to maintain his position demonstrated both the resources still available to the Seleucid monarchy and the limitations that constrained royal authority in the empire's reduced circumstances. The king commanded the loyalty of significant military forces, including veteran phalanx units stationed in the Syrian heartland and Iranian cavalry formations whose commanders had served the dynasty for generations. His control of major urban centres like Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris provided access to the administrative apparatus and financial resources necessary for extended military campaigns, while his diplomatic relationships with various client rulers offered potential sources of additional manpower and supplies. However, Demetrius faced fundamental disadvantages that reflected the broader transformation of the Hellenistic political system since the Roman intervention. His rejection by Rome, which had grown suspicious of his independent policies and potential for challenging Roman interests, deprived him of the international recognition that had become essential for legitimacy in the post-Apamea world. The king's efforts to restore Seleucid authority over territories that had achieved de facto independence during previous reigns created conflicts with local rulers who preferred their autonomous status to renewed subjection to central control. Alexander Ballas's victory at the Battle of the Oenoporus River in 150 BC eliminated Demetrius I and established a precedent for foreign intervention in Seleucid succession, disputes that would characterize the empire's remaining history. The engagement, fought in the rugged terrain of northern Syria, demonstrated how civil warfare had evolved to incorporate the tactical lessons learned from conflicts with Rome and other external enemies. Both armies employed mixed formations that combined traditional Hellenistic elements with innovations designed to counter the manipular tactics that had proven so effective against conventional phalanx formations. The battle's outcome resulted not from superior generalship or tactical innovation, but from the defection of key units whose commanders had been secretly negotiating with Ballas's agents for months before the engagement. Demetrius I's Iranian cavalry, whose families had served the Seleucid crown since the empire's foundation, abandoned their positions at the crucial moment and rode from the field, leaving the royal phalanx exposed to flanking attacks that quickly transformed an organised battle line into a massacre. The king's death during the subsequent rout eliminated the last ruler who possessed both the legitimacy of undisputed succession and the military capability to enforce royal authority throughout the empire's traditional territories. Alexander Ballas's reign, which lasted from 150 to 145 BC, revealed the hollowness of his victory and the impossibility of restoring effective central control over an empire that had become accustomed to fragmentation. Despite his Roman backing and initial military success, the new king faced immediate challenges from Demetrius I's surviving supporters and from provincial governors who had used the civil war as an opportunity to establish their own independent power bases. His attempts to govern through the traditional Seleucid administrative system encountered resistance from officials whose primary loyalty was to their local communities rather than to a monarch whose legitimacy remained questionable. The king's marriage to Cleopatra Thea, daughter of Ptolemy VI Philometor, represented an attempt to strengthen his position through diplomatic alliance with Egypt, but this relationship created new complications that further destabilized the empire. The marriage alliance required territorial concessions that reduced Seleucid control over Coele Syria, while the Egyptian influence at court alienated Syrian nobles who viewed foreign interference as a threat to their traditional privileges. Cleopatra. Thea's strong personality and political ambitions made her a power in her own right, creating a parallel centre of authority that competed with royal prerogatives and confused the chain of command throughout the imperial administration. The rise of Deodatus Tryphon as a military commander under Alexander Ballas introduced another destabilizing element into the empire's political landscape. Tryphon, whose origins remain obscure but who possessed considerable military talent and political acumen, initially served as a loyal general who helped secure Ballas's position against various challengers. However, his growing influence with the army and his popularity among Syrian populations who had grown weary of dynastic conflicts positioned him as a potential alternative to the established royal house. The return of Demetrius II Nicator in 147 BC, son of the defeated Demetrius I, created a three-way struggle for the Seleucid throne that paralysed imperial administration and invited foreign intervention from enemies who recognised the opportunities presented by internal chaos. The young Demetrius, who had been raised in Crete following his father's death, possessed the advantage of undisputed dynastic legitimacy, but lacked the military resources and local support networks that had enabled his rivals to establish their positions. His reliance on Cretan mercenaries and foreign advisors alienated Syrian nobles who preferred rulers with deeper roots in local society. The Battle of Antioch in 145 BC, which resulted in Alexander Ballas's death and Demetrius II's initial triumph, demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred in Seleucid military forces during the period of civil warfare. Both armies employed combined arms formations that integrated traditional phalanx units with cavalry, light infantry and artillery in ways that reflected lessons learned from Roman tactical methods. The extensive use of mercenaries drawn from throughout the Mediterranean world had introduced new weapons and fighting techniques that supplemented traditional Hellenistic military practices. Demetrius II's victory proved temporary, as Tryphon's control of significant military forces and his support among populations exhausted by civil warfare enabled him to mount an effective challenge to the new king's authority. The general's decision to proclaim the young Antiochus VI, son of Alexander Ballas, as the legitimate ruler provided him with a legal framework for resistance, while appealing to those who viewed Demetrius II as a foreign-backed usurper. This manoeuvre demonstrated the political sophistication that had developed among Seleucid military commanders, who understood that successful rebellion required ideological justification as well as military capability. The fragmentation of the empire accelerated during this period, as regional commanders found themselves forced to choose between competing claimants whose authority extended only as far as their military forces could project power. The traditional administrative system that had governed the empire since its foundation proved incapable of functioning effectively when royal authority was divided between rival courts, each claiming exclusive legitimacy and demanding exclusive loyalty from provincial officials. Tax collection became sporadic and often violent, as different factions attempted to extract resources from the same territories to finance their competing military campaigns. While the Seleucid heartland descended into chaos, external enemies moved systematically to exploit imperial weakness and absorb territories that had been integral parts of the empire since its foundation. The most significant threat emerged from the east, where Mithridates IV of Parthia had spent decades consolidating his control over the Iranian plateau and building the military capabilities necessary for major westward expansion. The Parthian king, whose realm had evolved from a relatively small territory around the Caspian Sea into a major power controlling the trade routes between Central Asia and Mesopotamia, possessed both the resources and strategic vision necessary to challenge Seleucid authority in its traditional strongholds. Mithridates III's invasion of Media in 148 BC marked the beginning of systematic Parthian expansion that would ultimately reduce the Seleucid Empire to a rump state, controlling little more than northern Syria and parts of Mesopotamia. The Parthian military system, based on the traditional Iranian emphasis on cavalry warfare, but incorporating innovations learned from conflicts with various enemies, proved remarkably effective against Seleucid forces weakened by civil warfare and demoralized by repeated defeats. Parthian cataphracts, with both horses and riders protected by scale armour, could deliver devastating charges against infantry formations, while their mounted archers provided the mobility and firepower necessary for extended campaigns across the vast distances of the Iranian world. The fall of Ecbatana, the ancient capital of Media, to Parthian forces in 147 BC eliminated Seleucid control over one of the empire's most important administrative centres and deprived the royal treasury of crucial revenues from the region's agricultural production and trade taxes. The city's capture also provided Mithridates I with access to the accumulated wealth of generations of Seleucid administration, including the royal mint that had produced much of the empire's currency and the archives that contained detailed records of administrative practices throughout the eastern territories. The Parthian advance into Mesopotamia during 141 BC represented an even more serious threat to Seleucid survival, as this region contained the empire's most productive agricultural areas and its most important commercial centres. The capture of Seleucia on the Tigris, the great city that Seleucus I had founded as the administrative capital of his eastern territories, symbolised the complete reversal of fortune that had transformed the Parthians from a minor border kingdom into the dominant power throughout the Iranian world. The city's Greek and Macedonian population, descendants of the original colonists who had maintained Hellenistic culture for 2.5 centuries, found themselves subjects of an Iranian monarchy whose political traditions and cultural values differed fundamentally from those under which they had prospered. The Parthian military success resulted not only from superior tactics and equipment, but also from their ability to exploit the ethnic and religious tensions that Seleucid policies had created throughout the eastern territories. Many Iranian nobles who had served the Seleucid crown for generations welcomed Parthian rule as a restoration of indigenous authority after centuries of Greek domination. Local populations, whose traditional religious practices had been marginalised by Hellenistic cultural policies, viewed the Parthians as liberators who would respect their ancestral customs and restore their temples to positions of influence and prosperity. The capture of Demetrius II by Parthian forces in 139 BC, during his ill-conceived expedition to recover the lost eastern territories, eliminated the last Seleucid monarch who possessed both undisputed legitimacy and significant military resources. The king's decision to launch this campaign despite the empire's internal chaos reflected either desperate courage or fatal miscalculation, as his forces were inadequate for the massive undertaking of reconquering territories that had been lost through years of systematic Parthian expansion. His defeat at the Battle of the Great Zab River and subsequent captivity in Hyrcania removed him from the political equation and created another succession crisis that further weakened imperial unity. The emergence of Antiochus VII Sidetes as the new Seleucid claimant represented the last serious attempt to restore the empire to its former power and territorial extent. The younger brother of Demetrius II, who had been governing the remaining Seleucid territories during the king's absence, possessed the military talent and strategic vision that had been lacking in recent rulers. His marriage to Cleopatra Thea, the widow of both Alexander Balas and Demetrius II, provided him with legitimacy and access to the political networks that she had developed during her previous marriages, while his control of the Syrian heartland gave him the resources necessary for ambitious military campaigns. Antiochus VII's initial campaigns against Tryphon demonstrated the military capabilities that would make him the most formidable Seleucid ruler since Antiochus III. The king's systematic reduction of Tryphon's strongholds throughout Syria employed sophisticated siege techniques that combined traditional Hellenistic methods with innovations learned from Roman engineering practices. His forces, recruited from throughout the empire's remaining territories and supplemented by mercenaries drawn from across the Mediterranean world, possessed the training and equipment necessary for major military operations against well-fortified positions. The Siege of Dor in 138 BC, where Tryphon had established his final stronghold, revealed both the strengths and limitations of Antiochus VII's restored military machine. The king's forces, numbering approximately 80,000 men according to contemporary sources, completely surrounded the coastal fortress and constructed elaborate siege works that prevented any possibility of relief or escape. The operation's success demonstrated that Seleucid military engineering had recovered much of its former sophistication, while the king's ability to maintain such a large army in the field for an extended period showed that imperial finances had stabilized sufficiently to support major campaigns. Tryphon's death during the siege's final phase eliminated the last significant internal challenger to Antiochus VII's authority and enabled the king to concentrate his resources on the far more ambitious project of reconquering the eastern territories that had been lost to Parthian expansion. The consolidation of royal control over Syria and the remaining Mesopotamian territories provided Antiochus VII with a secure base for operations against external enemies, while his diplomatic success in negotiating agreements with various client rulers extended his influence beyond the empire's formal boundaries. The king's preparations for his eastern campaign reflected both the scale of his ambitions and his realistic assessment of the challenges involved in confronting Parthian power at its peak. The army that he assembled during 130 BC represented the largest military force that the Seleucid Empire had fielded since the reign of Antiochus III, with units drawn from throughout the remaining territories and equipped with the finest weapons and armour that imperial workshops could produce. The expedition's logistical requirements necessitated extensive preparations, including the establishment of supply depots along the projected route of march and negotiations with local rulers who could provide additional resources during the campaign. The initial phases of Antiochus VII's eastern expedition achieved remarkable success, as Parthian forces proved unable to halt the advance of a well-organised and professionally led army that employed tactical methods specifically designed to counter traditional Iranian military strengths. The king's forces systematically recaptured the major cities of Mesopotamia, including Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris, while Parthian armies withdrew deeper into their Iranian heartland rather than risk decisive engagement against superior Seleucid forces. These victories restored imperial control over territories that had generated enormous revenues during the empire's golden age, and provided Antiochus VII with the resources necessary to continue his ambitious campaign of reconquest. The systematic recapture of Mesopotamian cities during 130-129 BC marked the zenith of Antiochus VII's military achievements and represented the last moment when Seleucid power appeared capable of genuine restoration. The king's forces, now swollen to nearly 120,000 men through local recruitment and the incorporation of surrendered Parthian units, controlled the vital trade routes that connected the Iranian plateau with the Mediterranean world. The revenues flowing into the royal treasury from restored territories enabled Antiochus to maintain his massive army while simultaneously funding the administrative apparatus necessary to govern reconquered regions whose populations had grown accustomed to Parthian rule during 2 decades of independence. The Parthian response to these devastating losses revealed the strategic depth and military flexibility that would ultimately determine the campaign's outcome. Phraates II, who'd succeeded his father Mithridates I in 138 BC, avoided the decisive battles that Antiochus VII sought while conducting a systematic withdrawal that drew Seleucid forces deeper into the Iranian interior. The Parthian king's strategy exploited the logistical vulnerabilities inherent in any attempt to project Hellenistic military power across the vast distances of the Iranian world, where supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of territory controlled by potentially hostile populations. The approach of winter in 129 BC forced Antiochus VII to disperse his army among the cities of Media, where the troops could be quartered and supplied during the harsh mountain winter that made active campaigning impossible. This decision, while tactically sound given the immediate circumstances, proved strategically disastrous as it divided Seleucid forces into isolated garrisons that could be attacked individually rather than as components of a unified military system. The king's confidence in the loyalty of local populations, based on their apparent submission during his victorious advance, failed to account for the resentment created by the burden of supporting foreign troops during the economically difficult winter months. The systematic uprising that erupted throughout Media during the winter of 129-128 BC demonstrated the effectiveness of Parthian intelligence networks and their ability to coordinate resistance across vast territories. Local populations, encouraged by Parthian agents and motivated by the economic hardships imposed by military occupation, attacked Seleucid garrisons simultaneously in dozens of cities and towns. These coordinated rebellions, timed to coincide with the arrival of Parthian relief forces, transformed what had appeared to be a secure occupation into a desperate struggle for survival in hostile territory. The massacre at Ecbatana, where an entire Seleucid division of approximately 8,000 men was annihilated by a combination of urban uprising and Parthian cavalry attack, exemplified the tactical predicament facing Antiochus VII's dispersed forces. The garrison, commanded by the experienced general Diodorus, had established defensive positions within the city's ancient citadel, but found themselves surrounded by hostile populations who controlled the surrounding streets and buildings. The Parthian relief force, consisting primarily of mounted archers whose mobility allowed them to strike at multiple points simultaneously, prevented any possibility of organised withdrawal while the urban rebels cut off access to supplies and reinforcements. Similar disasters befell Seleucid garrisons throughout the region as the carefully planned Parthian counteroffensive exploited every weakness in the imperial position. The heavy infantry formations that had proven so effective during the initial conquest found themselves unable to respond to the fluid tactics employed by combined Parthian and local forces. Phalanx units, designed for battlefield engagements against similarly organised opponents, proved vulnerable to the hit-and-run attacks that characterised this new phase of the conflict. Their elaborate equipment, including the 18-foot sarissas that had dominated ancient battlefields for centuries, became liabilities in the close-quarters urban fighting that determined control of individual cities. Antiochus VII's attempts to concentrate his surviving forces and restore unified command encountered obstacles that revealed the extent to which the strategic situation had deteriorated. Communications between scattered garrisons had been severed by Parthian cavalry units that controlled the roads connecting major population centres, while local uprisings had eliminated the administrative apparatus necessary for coordinating military operations across such vast distances. The king's own headquarters at Babylon came under increasing pressure as Parthian forces systematically eliminated outlying positions and tightened their encirclement of the remaining Seleucid strongholds. The final campaign that led to Antiochus VII's death began in early 129 BC, when the king assembled his remaining forces, estimated at fewer than 40,000 men, for a desperate attempt to break through Parthian encirclement and withdraw to the safety of Syria. The army that marched northward from Babylon bore little resemblance to the magnificent host that had crossed the Euphrates 2 years earlier, as casualties, disease and desertion had reduced it to a fraction of its original strength. The surviving troops, many of whom were veterans of multiple campaigns, retained their professional skills and unit cohesion, but their morale had been shattered by months of siege warfare and the constant threat of attack by an enemy who seemed to appear and disappear at will. The Battle of the Zab River, fought in the harsh winter conditions that made military operations extremely difficult, represented the final confrontation between Seleucid and Parthian forces for control of the Iranian world. Phraates II had assembled approximately 50,000 men for this decisive engagement, including the elite cataphract units whose heavy armour and long lances had made them legendary throughout the ancient world. The Parthian battle line extended for nearly a mile across the frozen river valley, with mounted archers on the flanks providing covering fire, while the heavily armoured cavalry prepared for the charges that would determine the battle's outcome. Antiochus VII's deployment reflected both his tactical skill and his recognition that this engagement would determine not only the campaign's fate, but the survival of the Seleucid Empire as a significant power. The royal phalanx, reduced to fewer than 15,000 men but still maintaining the disciplined formations that had conquered much of the known world under Alexander, occupied the centre of the line with their bronze shields locked together and their pikes projecting forward in an impenetrable wall of steel. The remaining cavalry, consisting primarily of Syrian and Mesopotamian units, whose loyalty had been tested by 2 years of continuous campaigning, protected the flanks while the king's personal guard formed a reserve that could be committed at the crucial moment. The engagement began with the traditional exchange of missiles between light troops, but the frozen ground and bitter cold affected the performance of both armies' equipment and reduced the effectiveness of archery that normally played a crucial role in determining battle outcomes. Parthian composite bows, designed for use by mounted warriors in the relatively mild climate of the Iranian plateau, proved less reliable in the extreme conditions, while Seleucid artillery found their torsion engines affected by the cold that reduced the tension of their twisted sinew springs. These technical difficulties forced both commanders to rely more heavily on close combat between heavy formations than either had originally planned. The decisive moment came when Phraates II personally led a massive cavalry charge against the Seleucid right flank, where Syrian horsemen had been weakened by weeks of inadequate supplies and constant harassment by Parthian scouts. The Parthian king, mounted on a magnificent Nisaean horse and protected by gilded scale armour that reflected the weak winter sunlight, became a visible symbol of his kingdom's resurgence as he led his cataphracts in a charge that shattered the Syrian formations and exposed the flank of the royal phalanx. The psychological impact of seeing their enemy's monarch leading from the front while their own king remained with the infantry reserves proved devastating to Seleucid morale. Antiochus VII's response to this crisis demonstrated the personal courage that had made him the most respected Seleucid ruler since Antiochus III, as he led his guard cavalry in a countercharge designed to restore his army's tactical position and prevent complete collapse. Contemporary accounts describe the king fighting in the front ranks, his purple cloak and golden diadem making him a conspicuous target for enemy weapons as he attempted to rally his wavering troops through personal example. His horse, a magnificent Arabian stallion that had carried him through numerous previous battles, fell pierced by multiple Parthian arrows, but the king continued fighting on foot until a cataphract's lance finally ended his life, and with it the last realistic hope of Seleucid restoration. The destruction of the royal army that followed Antiochus VII's death was complete and systematic, as Parthian forces showed no mercy to enemies who had invaded their homeland and threatened their independence. The surviving phalanx units, surrounded and cut off from any possibility of retreat, fought with the desperate courage of professional soldiers who understood that surrender would likely mean death or slavery. Their disciplined formations held together even as Parthian cavalry attacked from all directions, but their heavy equipment and exhausted condition made prolonged resistance impossible against enemies whose mobility allowed them to choose the time and place of each engagement. The few Seleucid survivors who managed to escape the battlefield brought news of the disaster to the remaining imperial territories, where the king's death created an immediate succession crisis that paralysed what remained of the central government. The absence of any clear heir with both the legitimacy and military capability necessary to maintain royal authority invited challenges from various claimants whose competing ambitions would further fragment the empire's remaining territories. Cleopatra Thea, the queen who had survived 3 royal marriages and possessed extensive political experience, attempted to maintain continuity by ruling in the name of her minor sons, but her authority extended little beyond the immediate vicinity of Antioch. The return of Demetrius II from Parthian captivity in 129 BC, negotiated by Phraates II as part of his strategy for destabilizing the remaining Seleucid territories, introduced another complicating factor into an already chaotic political situation. The former king, who had spent a decade in comfortable exile at the Parthian court, returned to find his empire reduced to a fraction of its former size and his authority challenged by multiple rivals who had established independent power bases during his absence. His attempts to restore central control encountered resistance from local commanders who had grown accustomed to autonomy and viewed his return as a threat to their established positions. The simultaneous emergence of multiple claimants to the Seleucid throne reflected the complete breakdown of the traditional succession system that had provided stability during the empire's earlier centuries. Alexander II Zabinus, who claimed to be the son of Alexander Ballas, established himself in Damascus with Egyptian support and began minting coins that proclaimed his royal status. Antiochus VIII, Grypus, the son of Demetrius II and Cleopatra Thea, commanded loyalty among Syrian nobles who viewed him as the legitimate heir to his father's position. Antiochus IX Cyzicenus, another son of Cleopatra Thea by Antiochus VII, possessed equally valid dynastic claims and controlled significant military forces in Cilicia and parts of Syria. The civil wars that erupted between these competing claimants during the 120 SBC completed the transformation of the Seleucid Empire from a great power into a collection of petty kingdoms whose rulers spent more energy fighting each other than defending their territories against external enemies. The traditional administrative system that had governed the empire since its foundation proved incapable of functioning when royal authority was divided between multiple courts, each claiming exclusive legitimacy while controlling only limited territories. Tax collection became sporadic and often violent, as different factions attempted to extract resources from the same regions to finance their competing military campaigns. The rise of local strongmen throughout the empire's remaining territories reflected the collapse of central authority and the emergence of feudal relationships that replaced the traditional Hellenistic governmental system. Arab chieftains in the Syrian desert established independent principalities that controlled the caravan routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean coast, collecting tolls and tribute that had previously flowed to the royal treasury. Armenian nobles in the northern territories acknowledged nominal Seleucid suzerainty, while pursuing independent foreign policies that aligned their interests with Rome, Parthia, or other powers depending on immediate circumstances. The Etrurian expansion into the Lebanese mountains and the Bekaa Valley demonstrated how local populations could exploit imperial weakness to establish autonomous territories that gradually evolved into independent kingdoms. The Etrurians, Arab people who had traditionally served as auxiliaries in Seleucid armies, used their knowledge of mountain warfare and their control of strategic passes to create a state that dominated the trade routes connecting Damascus with the Mediterranean ports. Their capital at Chalcis became the centre of a kingdom that would persist for over a century, demonstrating the viability of small states that could adapt to local conditions more effectively than the centralised imperial system. The Nabatean kingdom centred at Petra represented perhaps the most successful example of how former Seleucid subjects could achieve independence and prosperity through adaptation to changing political circumstances. The Nabateans, whose ancestors had served as caravan guides and traders throughout the Arabian Peninsula, exploited the collapse of imperial control over the incense routes to establish a commercial empire that extended from the Red Sea to Damascus. Their sophisticated understanding of desert warfare and their control of water sources in the arid regions of southern Syria and Jordan made them virtually invulnerable to the weakened military forces that the competing Seleucid claimants could deploy against them. The transformation of major cities from imperial administrative centres into autonomous city-states marked another dimension of the empire's fragmentation that would characterise its final century. Seleucia and Pieria, the great port that had served as Antioch's connection to the Mediterranean world, established its own government and began conducting independent foreign relations with Rome and other powers. The city's control of crucial harbour facilities and its accumulated wealth from centuries of commercial activity provided the resources necessary for maintaining military forces capable of defending its independence against any of the competing royal claimants. Damascus, which had served as the administrative centre for southern Syria since the empire's foundation, similarly evolved into an independent power centre, whose rulers acknowledged nominal Seleucid authority, while pursuing policies determined by local interests rather than imperial directives. The city's strategic position at the intersection of trade routes connecting Mesopotamia, Egypt and Arabia made it too valuable for any external power to ignore, but its strong fortifications and the loyalty of surrounding populations enabled it to maintain autonomy despite pressure from multiple directions. The growing Roman influence in Syrian affairs during this period reflected the Republic's recognition that the Seleucid Empire's collapse created both opportunities and dangers that required careful management. Roman merchants and diplomats had established extensive networks throughout the former imperial territories, providing intelligence about local conditions while promoting commercial relationships that served Roman economic interests. The Republic's policy of supporting weak rulers who could be easily controlled while preventing the emergence of any power strong enough to challenge Roman hegemony required constant diplomatic intervention in the succession disputes that plagued the remaining Seleucid territories. The Senate's decision to recognize different Seleucid claimants at different times, often supporting multiple rivals simultaneously, demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of Hellenistic politics that Roman diplomats had developed through decades of Eastern involvement. This policy of calculated instability ensured that no single ruler could accumulate sufficient power to threaten Roman interests, while maintaining the fiction of Seleucid independence that served various diplomatic purposes. The transformation of the empire into a Roman client state proceeded gradually through this process of managed fragmentation, rather than through direct conquest that might have provoked resistance from other Hellenistic powers. The death of Antiochus VII Sidetes in 129 BC marked the definitive end of Seleucid power as a force capable of influencing the broader Mediterranean world, yet the empire's final agony would stretch across another 65 years of increasingly desperate attempts to maintain relevance in a political landscape dominated by Rome and Parthia. The return of Demetrius II from Parthian captivity brought with it the illusion of restored legitimacy, but the king who had spent a decade in comfortable exile at Ctesiphon found himself ruling territories that had shrunk to little more than northern Syria and parts of Cilicia. His attempts to reassert royal authority encountered systematic resistance from local commanders who'd grown accustomed to independence during his absence and viewed his restoration as a threat to their established positions. The emergence of Alexander II Sabinus as a rival claimant in 128 BC demonstrated how completely the traditional mechanisms of Seleucid succession had collapsed under the pressure of territorial losses and dynastic chaos. Sabinus, whose claim to be the son of Alexander Ballas was almost certainly fraudulent, established himself in Damascus with Egyptian financial backing and began systematically capturing Syrian cities whose garrisons proved more loyal to immediate paymasters than to abstract concepts of dynastic legitimacy. His forces, consisting primarily of mercenaries recruited from throughout the eastern Mediterranean, possessed the professional competence necessary for siege warfare, but lacked the cultural connections to local populations that had once made Seleucid rule acceptable to diverse ethnic communities. The civil war between Demetrius II and Sabinus revealed the extent to which military effectiveness had replaced hereditary right as the primary determinant of royal authority. Both armies employed tactical methods that reflected decades of adaptation to Roman military superiority, with traditional phalanx formations supplemented by auxiliary units trained in manipular tactics and siege techniques Borrowed from Republican engineering practices, the Battle of Damascus in 126 BC showcased these evolutionary changes, as Zabinus deployed his mercenary phalanx in a defensive formation designed to absorb cavalry charges, while his Thracian auxiliaries conducted flanking maneuvers that exploited gaps in Demetrius's battle line. The engagement began at dawn with the ritual exchange of arrows between opposing light infantry, but the decisive action occurred when Zabinus personally led his Gallic mercenaries in a coordinated assault against the royal centre where Demetrius had positioned his most reliable troops. The pretender's forces, many of whom were Celtic warriors whose families had served various Mediterranean powers for generations, brought fighting techniques that differed significantly from traditional Hellenistic methods. Their long swords and oval shields, combined with their reputation for ferocity in close combat, created psychological advantages that proved decisive when the battle devolved into the hand-to-hand fighting that determined most contemporary engagements. Demetrius II's death during the chaotic retreat that followed his army's collapse eliminated the last Seleucid monarch who possessed both undisputed dynastic credentials and significant military experience. His body, found among the casualties 3 days after the battle, bore multiple wounds that suggested he had continued fighting even after his position had become hopeless. The purple cloak and golden diadem that identified his royal status had been stripped away by looters, leaving only the distinctive scars from his earlier campaigns to confirm his identity for the burial party that eventually recovered his remains. Zabinus's triumph proved as ephemeral as most victories in the fragmenting empire, as his mercenary forces demanded immediate payment that his limited territorial base could not provide. The systematic looting of Damascus's temples and private residences that followed his occupation alienated the urban population whose cooperation was essential for effective governance, while his reliance on foreign troops created resentment among Syrian nobles who viewed their exclusion from positions of authority as a betrayal of traditional Hellenistic administrative practices. Within 18 months of his victory, Zabinus faced rebellions throughout his territory as local commanders concluded that his rule offered fewer advantages than accommodation with alternative claimants or outright independence. The simultaneous emergence of multiple members of the royal family as competing claimants reflected the desperation that had overtaken Seleucid politics, as traditional succession mechanisms proved incapable of producing stable government. Antiochus the non-nate Grypus, the son of Demetrius II and Cleopatra Thea, commanded support among Syrian military colonists whose families had served the dynasty for generations and who viewed him as the legitimate heir to his father's reduced kingdom. His rival, Antiochus IX Cyzicenus, born from Cleopatra Thea's marriage to Antiochus VII, possessed equally valid hereditary claims while controlling different military units and territorial bases that reflected the complex family alliances that had developed during decades of civil warfare. Cleopatra Thea's attempt to maintain central authority through her position as Queen Mother demonstrated both the political sophistication she had developed through her marriages to 3 successive kings and the fundamental impossibility of restoring effective royal control over territories that had become accustomed to fragmentation. Her decision to poison Antiochus VIII when he appeared to be consolidating power at her expense revealed the extent to which dynastic relationships had been corrupted by the struggle for survival in an empire that could no longer support multiple competing courts. The king's survival, achieved by forcing his mother to drink the poisoned wine she had prepared for him, marked the beginning of a new phase of civil warfare that would consume the empire's remaining resources while providing opportunities for external enemies to absorb additional territories. The war between the two Antiochi that erupted in 116 BC represented the nadir of Seleucid military effectiveness, as royal armies that had once conquered territories from the Aegean to the Indus River found themselves reduced to conducting siege warfare against fortified cities, whose populations often preferred independence to subjection by either claimant. the Siege of Antioch in 114 BC, where Antiochus IX attempted to capture the traditional royal capital from his half-brother's forces, demonstrated how far Seleucid military capabilities had deteriorated since the empire's golden age. Both armies employed siege engines and tactical methods that reflected contemporary Roman and Hellenistic practices, but their limited manpower and financial resources prevented the kind of systematic operations that had characterized earlier Seleucid campaigns. The defenders of Antioch, commanded by Antiochus VIII's experienced general Trypho, had constructed elaborate fortifications that incorporated lessons learned from Roman siege warfare, while adapting to the specific topographical challenges presented by the city's position on the Orontes River. The defensive works included multiple lines of walls connected by underground tunnels, artillery positions designed to provide interlocking fields of fire, and sally ports that allowed defenders to conduct surprise attacks against besieging forces. These sophisticated fortifications reflected the accumulated engineering knowledge of 3 centuries of Hellenistic warfare, but their effectiveness was limited by the reduced garrison that Antiochus VIII could maintain during an extended siege. Antiochus IX's besieging forces, estimated at approximately 15,000 men, represented a significant portion of the military manpower available to either claimant, but remained inadequate for the systematic investment of a major fortified city. His army included traditional phalanx units recruited from the military colonies that still acknowledged Seleucid authority, Arab auxiliaries whose desert warfare experience provided valuable reconnaissance capabilities, and a small contingent of war elephants that had been acquired through diplomatic negotiations with Indian kingdoms seeking to influence Syrian politics. The elephants, while impressive in appearance, numbered only 6 animals and proved of limited tactical value against fortified positions that had been specifically designed to counter their psychological impact. The siege's prolongation through the winter of 114 to 113 BC created logistical challenges that neither side possessed the resources to resolve effectively. Antiochus IX's forces, dependent on supplies transported across territories controlled by hostile local commanders, faced chronic shortages of food and military equipment that reduced their combat effectiveness and encouraged desertion among troops whose families lived in regions affected by the continuing warfare. The defenders of Antioch, while protected by their fortifications, found their situation equally precarious, as the siege prevented normal commercial activity and reduced the city's population to subsisting on stored grain that had been accumulated during more prosperous periods. The intervention of Tigranes and of Armenia in Syrian affairs during 83 BC represented a fundamental transformation in the political dynamics that had governed the region since the Seleucid Empire's foundation. The Armenian king, whose realm had expanded systematically during the previous decades through conquest of territories in eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, possessed both the military capability and strategic vision necessary to impose unity on the fractured Syrian territories through external conquest. His decision to intervene reflected not merely opportunistic expansion, but a calculated response to the power vacuum that had developed as competing Seleucid claimants exhausted their resources in futile civil warfare. Tigranes' army that crossed the Euphrates in late 83 BC represented the most formidable military force that had operated in Syria since the campaigns of Antiochus VII. With approximately 100,000 men drawn from throughout the Armenian Empire and equipped according to standards that reflected both traditional Caucasian military practices and innovations borrowed from Roman and Parthian opponents. The Armenian phalanx, organized along Hellenistic lines, but recruited from mountain populations whose physical characteristics and cultural traditions differed significantly from traditional Greek military colonists, possessed the discipline and equipment necessary for siege warfare, while maintaining the mobility essential for operations across the diverse terrain of Syria and Mesopotamia. The Armenian cavalry, consisting primarily of heavily armoured cataphracts, whose tactics had been refined through decades of warfare against various enemies, provided Tigranes with the striking power necessary to defeat the weakened forces that the competing Seleucid claimants could deploy against him. These horsemen, mounted on the sturdy horses bred in the Armenian highlands and protected by scale armour that covered both rider and mount, could deliver devastating charges against infantry formations while possessing sufficient defensive capability to withdraw and regroup for subsequent attacks. Their long lances, designed specifically for mounted combat, could penetrate most contemporary armour at close range, while their training emphasised the coordinated manoeuvres necessary for effective cavalry operations in the varied topographical conditions that characterise Syrian battlefields. The systematic conquest of Syrian cities that followed Tigranes' invasion demonstrated both the effectiveness of Armenian military organisation and the extent to which local populations had grown weary of the civil warfare that had plagued their territories for decades. Damascus fell after a brief siege that showcased Armenian siege techniques, including the use of massive catapults that could breach fortified walls and the deployment of specialised mining units that could undermine defensive positions. The city's surrender negotiations, conducted by civic leaders who had grown tired of supporting competing royal claimants, established precedents for the administrative arrangements that would govern Armenian rule throughout the conquered territories. Antioch's capitulation in 83 BC marked the effective end of independent Seleucid rule and the incorporation of Syria into the expanding Armenian Empire that Tigranes was constructing throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The last Seleucid garrison, commanded by officers whose families had served the dynasty since its foundation, negotiated surrender terms that preserved their personal safety while acknowledging Armenian sovereignty over territories that had been the empire's heartland for 2.5 centuries. The ceremony that marked the formal transfer of authority included the presentation of the royal regalia to Tigranes, symbolising the end of the political system that Seleucus I had established following Alexander's death. The administrative integration of Syria into the Armenian system revealed Tigranes' sophisticated understanding of the governmental challenges involved in ruling diverse populations across vast territories. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Armenian institutions throughout the conquered regions, he adapted existing Seleucid administrative practices while inserting Armenian officials at key positions within the established bureaucratic hierarchy. This approach preserved the expertise of experienced administrators while ensuring Armenian control over crucial functions like tax collection and military recruitment that determined the central government's capacity to maintain authority over distant territories. The cultural policies that Tigranes implemented in the former Seleucid territories reflected his recognition that successful imperial rule required accommodation with existing social and religious institutions rather than systematic attempts to impose cultural uniformity. Greek educational institutions, including the gymnasia that had served as centres of Hellenistic culture for centuries, continued to operate under Armenian patronage while incorporating elements of Armenian intellectual traditions that enriched their curricula. The theatrical festivals and athletic competitions that had provided entertainment for urban populations throughout the Seleucid period received royal support that demonstrated continuity with established cultural practices. Religious syncretism flourished under Armenian rule as Tigranes encouraged the integration of Armenian, Greek and local Syrian deities within unified ceremonial frameworks that appealed to diverse ethnic communities. The great temple of Apollo at Daphne, which had served as a centre of Seleucid royal cult for generations, received substantial investments that enhanced its architectural grandeur, while accommodating Armenian religious practices within its expanded ceremonial spaces. This approach created religious institutions that could serve multiple communities simultaneously, while providing the ideological foundation necessary for stable imperial rule over culturally diverse populations. The economic transformation of Syria under Armenian administration demonstrated Tigranes' understanding of the commercial relationships that had made the region prosperous during the Seleucid Golden Age. The restoration of security along the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean ports encouraged the revival of commercial activity that had been disrupted by decades of civil warfare, while Armenian investment in harbour facilities and road maintenance improved the infrastructure necessary for long-distance commerce. The standardization of weights, measures and currency throughout the Armenian Empire facilitated trade relationships that extended from the Caucasus Mountains to the Egyptian frontier. The emergence of new merchant families whose wealth derived from trade relationships that transcended traditional political boundaries reflected the economic opportunities created by Armenian unification of territories that had been fragmented among competing Seleucid claimants. These commercial networks, often based on family relationships that extended across ethnic and religious divisions, developed the financial instruments and transportation systems necessary for conducting business across the vast distances that separated Armenian territories. Their success demonstrated the economic potential that could be realized when political stability replaced the chronic warfare that had characterized the final decades of Seleucid rule. The survival of Seleucid claimants in marginal territories that remained beyond Armenian control created ongoing complications for Tigranes' efforts to establish complete authority over the former empire's territories. Antiochus XIII. Asiaticus, who claimed descent from the main royal line, maintained a precarious existence in Cilicia, where he commanded the loyalty of military units whose families had served the Seleucid crown for generations. His forces, numbering fewer than 5,000 men, lacked the strength necessary for major military operations, but possessed sufficient capability to conduct guerrilla warfare that disrupted Armenian administration in border regions. Philip II Philorameus, whose royal credentials were even more questionable than those of his competitors, established himself in Damascus after Tigranes' forces had moved northward to address other strategic priorities. His ability to maintain control over this crucial commercial centre reflected both the support of local merchants who preferred familiar Seleucid administrative practices to Armenian innovations and the tactical advantages provided by the city's strong fortifications. The revenues generated by Damascus's position at the intersection of major trade routes provided Philip with the financial resources necessary to maintain military forces while conducting diplomatic negotiations with the various external powers who might provide support against Armenian expansion. The complex diplomatic maneuvering that characterized relationships between the surviving Seleucid claimants and potential foreign patrons revealed the extent to which the traditional Hellenistic state system had been transformed by Roman hegemony and the emergence of new regional powers. Both Antiochus XIII and Philip II sought Roman recognition and support, understanding that republican approval had become essential for legitimacy in the Eastern Mediterranean political system. Their competing embassies to Rome, each claiming exclusive right to Seleucid inheritance while denouncing their rivals as usurpers, provided Roman senators with opportunities to influence Syrian affairs while avoiding direct military intervention that might prove costly or politically controversial. The Roman civil wars that erupted during the 80s BC created new opportunities and dangers for the surviving Seleucid territories as competing Roman commanders sought Eastern allies and resources to support their political ambitions. Lucius Cornelius Sulla's conflict with Gaius Marius and their respective supporters transformed the Eastern Mediterranean into a theatre where Roman factional disputes played out through proxy conflicts between local rulers who aligned themselves with different Roman patrons. The Seleucid claimants, despite their reduced circumstances, possessed sufficient military capability and territorial control to serve as valuable allies for Roman commanders who needed Eastern support for their Western political struggles. The Roman civil wars that had transformed the Eastern Mediterranean into a battleground for competing republican factions reached their decisive phase When Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus arrived in Syria during the summer of 64 BC with extraordinary proconsular authority and a mandate to reorganize the entire region according to Roman strategic interests. Pompey's eastern command, granted by the Lex Manilia in 66 BC, had already achieved spectacular success against Mithridates VI of Pontus, and had demonstrated the Republic's capacity to project overwhelming military force across vast distances when circumstances demanded decisive action. The general who now turned his attention to the remnants of the Seleucid Empire commanded approximately 60,000 veteran legionaries whose experience in Anatolian and Caucasian warfare had prepared them for the complex political and military challenges that awaited in Syria. The Syria that Pompey encountered bore little resemblance to the prosperous heartland of the great Hellenistic Empire that had once stretched from the Aegean to the Indus River. 2 decades of Armenian occupation under Tigranes, I had been followed by the gradual reassertion of local autonomy as competing Seleucid claimants, Arab chieftains, and urban oligarchies carved out independent territories from the collapsing imperial structure. The landscape was dotted with fortified cities whose walls showed the scars of repeated sieges, while the countryside revealed the economic devastation that resulted from chronic warfare and the breakdown of the administrative systems that had once maintained irrigation networks and protected commercial routes. Antiochus Asiaticus, who had managed to maintain precarious control over Damascus and portions of southern Syria through a combination of diplomatic maneuvering and military survival, represented the last vestige of legitimate Seleucid authority when Pompey's advance guard reached the outskirts of the ancient capital. The king's court, housed in a palace complex that had been repeatedly damaged and hastily repaired during decades of conflict, retained the ceremonial trappings of Hellenistic monarchy but lacked the substance of effective government. His treasury contained fewer than 50 talents, barely sufficient to maintain his bodyguard of Thracian mercenaries, while his administrative apparatus consisted of a handful of Greek secretaries whose families had served the dynasty since its golden age. The meeting between Pompey and Antiochus III in the summer of 64 BC took place in the Roman camp outside Damascus, where the disparity between the two leaders' circumstances became immediately apparent to all observers. The Roman commander, surrounded by his staff officers and protected by veteran centurions, whose scarred faces and professional bearing testified to decades of successful campaigning, received the Seleucid king with the courtesy due to a legitimate monarch, while making clear that their relationship would be determined by Roman strategic requirements rather than traditional diplomatic protocols. Antiochus III, accompanied by a small retinue of courtiers whose threadbare clothing and anxious expressions revealed their desperate circumstances, attempted to maintain royal dignity while essentially pleading for Roman recognition and protection. Pompey's systematic evaluation of the territorial claims presented by various Seleucid pretenders revealed the extent to which dynastic fragmentation had rendered traditional concepts of legitimacy meaningless in practical terms. Philip II, Philorameus, who controlled portions of northern Syria from his stronghold at Beroea, dispatched envoys who presented genealogical charts purporting to demonstrate his superior hereditary rights to the throne, while simultaneously offering substantial bribes for Roman recognition. Demetrius III, Euchaerus, whose territorial base had been reduced to a few fortified cities in the Lebanese mountains, claimed authority over regions he'd not controlled for years while promising military support for Roman operations against any remaining opposition. The Roman commander's decision to hear these competing claims in formal judicial proceedings demonstrated his understanding that the establishment of legitimate Roman authority required careful attention to legal precedents that would satisfy both Roman public opinion and Eastern populations accustomed to monarchical government. The hearings, conducted in the traditional Roman manner, with detailed testimony and documentary evidence, provided Pompey with comprehensive intelligence about the political relationships and territorial arrangements that had developed during the empire's final decades, while creating a public record that would justify whatever decisions he chose to make. The testimony presented during these proceedings revealed the sophisticated understanding of Hellenistic political traditions that Roman administrators had developed through decades of Eastern involvement. Greek secretaries who had served multiple claimants provided detailed accounts of succession disputes dating back to the reign of Antiochus VIII, while local magistrates from various Syrian cities described the administrative arrangements that had enabled their communities to maintain autonomy during periods when royal authority had effectively collapsed. Arab chieftains whose territories straddled traditional provincial boundaries explained the tribal relationships and commercial agreements that had replaced imperial administration in regions where central government had ceased to function. Pompey's ultimate decision to abolish the Seleucid monarchy and incorporate Syria directly into the Roman provincial system reflected both practical considerations about administrative efficiency and strategic calculations about regional stability. The formal ceremony that announced this decision took place in Antioch during September 64 BC, with representatives from throughout the former empire assembled to witness the transformation of territories that had maintained nominal independence for nearly 2.5 centuries. The Roman commander, wearing the toga praetexta that symbolized his proconsular authority, read the Senatus Consultum that established the new province, while Seleucid royal regalia were formally deposited in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus as symbols of Rome's victory over the last Hellenistic monarchy. The administrative framework that Pompey established for the new Syrian province demonstrated the sophisticated governmental methods that had enabled Rome to manage diverse populations across the Mediterranean world. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Roman institutions throughout territories that encompassed multiple ethnic groups and cultural traditions, he created a flexible system that preserved local autonomy where possible while ensuring Roman control over strategic functions like taxation, military recruitment, and foreign relations. The provincial capital at Antioch received extensive investments in infrastructure and public buildings that would symbolize Roman power, while providing the administrative facilities necessary for governing territories that extended from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean coast. The urban planning projects that Pompey initiated in Antioch reflected both Roman engineering capabilities and sensitivity to local architectural traditions that had developed over centuries of Hellenistic rule. The expansion of the city's harbour facilities included the construction of massive breakwaters that could protect Roman naval squadrons while accommodating the commercial vessels that would restore Syria's position in Mediterranean trade networks. New aqueducts, built according to Roman specifications but incorporating Syrian masonry techniques, provided reliable water supplies for the expanded population that would result from the establishment of Roman administration and the settlement of veteran colonists. The transformation of the Seleucid royal palace into the governor's residence required extensive modifications that would accommodate Roman administrative practices while preserving architectural elements that symbolized continuity with established governmental traditions. Roman engineers removed the elaborate throne room where Seleucid kings had received foreign ambassadors and conducted state ceremonies, replacing it with practical offices where provincial officials could manage the complex bureaucratic procedures necessary for imperial administration. However, they preserved the palace's distinctive Hellenistic facades and maintained the ceremonial gardens that had served as settings for diplomatic receptions, recognizing that effective Roman rule required respect for local cultural sensibilities. The fate of the surviving members of the Seleucid royal family illustrated both Roman pragmatism in dealing with potential sources of future instability and the personal dimensions of imperial collapse that affected individuals whose entire identity had been shaped by their connection to monarchical authority. Antiochus III received a substantial financial settlement that enabled him to purchase property in Rome, where he could live comfortably while remaining under discreet surveillance that would prevent any attempts to organize resistance to Roman rule. His integration into Roman aristocratic circles proceeded smoothly, as his Greek education and familiarity with Hellenistic cultural traditions made him a valued addition to intellectual salons, where Roman nobles sought to demonstrate their sophistication through association with Eastern royalty. The younger members of the royal family, including several children whose fathers' identities remained disputed among the various claimants, were enrolled in Roman educational institutions where they could acquire the skills necessary for careers in imperial service, while losing the cultural connections that might have made them focal points for anti-Roman sentiment. This policy of cultural assimilation, implemented through carefully managed educational and social opportunities, transformed potential threats to Roman authority into supporters whose success depended on the continued stability of imperial rule. The economic integration of Syria into the Roman system required careful attention to the commercial relationships that had sustained urban prosperity during the Seleucid period, while adapting to the different fiscal requirements of Republican administration. Pompey's financial specialists conducted comprehensive surveys of agricultural production, commercial activity, and existing tax obligations that would serve as the foundation for the tribute assessments that would fund provincial administration and contribute to Roman military expenses. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency according to Roman specifications facilitated trade relationships, while ensuring that provincial revenues could be efficiently transferred to the Roman treasury. The restoration of security along the trade routes that connected Syria with Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt encouraged the revival of commercial activity that had been disrupted by decades of political instability. Roman military patrols, equipped with detailed maps and supported by supply depots established at regular intervals, could respond rapidly to bandit attacks or tribal raids that threatened merchant caravans. The construction of fortified way stations, built according to Roman military specifications, but staffed by local auxiliaries familiar with regional conditions, provided safe havens where travellers could rest and resupply during long-distance journeys. The transformation of major Syrian cities from autonomous political entities into administrative centres within the Roman provincial system required delicate negotiations that balanced imperial requirements with local traditions that had developed over centuries of urban self-government. Damascus, whose strategic position at the intersection of major trade routes made it essential for provincial administration, received a new charter that preserved its traditional civic institutions while subordinating them to Roman oversight. The city council continued to manage local affairs, including the maintenance of public buildings and the organisation of religious festivals, but its decisions required approval from Roman officials who ensured compliance with imperial policies. Seleucia in Pieria, the great port that had served as Antioch's connection to the Mediterranean world since the early Seleucid period, underwent extensive redevelopment that enhanced its capacity to handle the increased commercial activity that would result from Roman administration. New harbour installations, built with Roman engineering expertise, but employing local construction techniques that had been refined through centuries of experience with regional weather patterns, could accommodate the larger vessels that Roman merchants preferred for long-distance trade. The expansion of warehouse facilities and the construction of specialised docks for different types of cargo demonstrated Roman understanding of the logistical requirements that would sustain provincial prosperity. The establishment of Roman law as the supreme legal authority throughout Syria required careful integration with existing legal traditions that had governed relationships between different ethnic and religious communities for generations. Pompey's legal advisors, many of whom possessed extensive experience in Eastern affairs, developed a hierarchical system that allowed local courts to continue handling routine civil matters while reserving criminal cases and disputes involving Roman citizens for Roman magistrates. This arrangement preserved the autonomy that various communities had enjoyed under Seleucid rule while ensuring that Roman interests would receive appropriate protection. The settlement of Roman veterans in strategic locations throughout the new province served multiple purposes that reflected sophisticated understanding of the requirements for maintaining imperial control over potentially restive populations. The colonies established at Berytus, Heliopolis, and other carefully selected sites provided homes for soldiers whose service had earned them land grants, while creating centres of Roman culture that would influence surrounding communities. These settlements, organised according to traditional Roman municipal principles but adapted to local climatic and topographical conditions, became models for the urban development that would characterise Roman Syria for the next several centuries. The veterans who received these colonial assignments brought with them not only military experience that could be mobilised for provincial defence, but also practical skills in engineering, agriculture, and craftsmanship that would contribute to economic development throughout the region. Their families, many of whom included wives and children from various parts of the Roman world, created cosmopolitan communities that facilitated cultural exchange while maintaining distinctively Roman institutional frameworks. The schools, temples, and public buildings that they constructed in their new homes demonstrated Roman architectural principles, while incorporating local materials and decorative elements that reflected regional artistic traditions. The integration of Syrian auxiliary units into the Roman military system provided opportunities for local populations to participate in imperial service, while contributing specialised capabilities that enhanced Roman tactical flexibility. The Arab cavalry units, whose desert warfare experience had made them valuable allies for various Seleucid claimants, found new employment in Roman service, where their mobility and knowledge of regional terrain proved essential for border security and reconnaissance operations. Their traditional weapons and fighting techniques, refined through generations of tribal warfare, complemented Roman tactical methods while providing capabilities that regular legionary formations could not duplicate. The recruitment of Syrian infantry units, drawn primarily from urban populations that possessed the literacy and technical skills necessary for specialised military roles, created career opportunities that had been unavailable during the chaotic final decades of Seleucid rule. These soldiers, trained according to Roman standards but retaining familiarity with local languages and customs, served as intermediaries between Roman commanders and indigenous populations, while providing essential intelligence about political developments throughout the province. Their success in Roman service demonstrated the benefits that imperial integration could provide for ambitious individuals regardless of their ethnic background. The religious policies that Pompey implemented throughout Syria reflected Roman recognition that successful provincial administration required accommodation with established spiritual traditions while promoting civic cults that would strengthen loyalty to imperial authority. The great temples at Baalbek, Damascus, and other major centres received Roman patronage that funded architectural improvements and enhanced their ceremonial capabilities, while their priesthoods were incorporated into the civic hierarchies that governed urban affairs. This approach created religious institutions that could serve both traditional worshippers and Roman colonists while providing ideological foundations for imperial loyalty. The immediate aftermath of Roman annexation revealed both the opportunities and challenges that would characterize Syrian development under imperial rule. The restoration of political stability encouraged economic recovery as merchants and craftsmen could plan long-term investments without fear of sudden political upheavals that might destroy their accumulated wealth. Agricultural production increased as farmers could cultivate their fields without concern about military campaigns that might devastate their crops or conscript their labour for military purposes. Urban construction projects, funded by a combination of Roman investment and local resources, provided employment opportunities while creating the infrastructure necessary for continued growth. However, the cultural tensions that accompanied Roman rule created ongoing challenges for provincial administrators who needed to balance imperial requirements with local sensitivities that had been shaped by centuries of Hellenistic influence. The introduction of Roman legal procedures, while generally more efficient than the fragmented judicial systems that had developed during the empire's decline, sometimes conflicted with traditional practices that various communities considered essential to their cultural identity. The establishment of Roman religious festivals alongside existing celebrations created scheduling conflicts and resource competition that required careful diplomatic management. The transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean political system that resulted from Pompey's settlement extended far beyond the formal boundaries of the new Syrian province, as neighbouring kingdoms and tribal confederations adjusted their policies to accommodate the reality of direct Roman administration in territories that had been centres of Hellenistic power for nearly 3 centuries. The Hasmonean kingdom of Judea, the Nabatean commercial empire, and the various Anatolian principalities that had emerged from the collapse of Seleucid authority all recognized that their survival depended on maintaining favorable relationships with Roman power, while preserving sufficient autonomy to satisfy their own population's cultural and political expectations. The death of Antiochus XIII. Asiaticus in 64 BC and Pompey's formal abolition of the Seleucid monarchy mark not merely the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of an extraordinary experiment in cross-cultural governance that had shaped the ancient world for nearly 3 centuries. The empire that Seleucus they had carved from the eastern territories of Alexander's conquests had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a vast multi-ethnic state that successfully integrated Greek, Iranian, Mesopotamian, and Semitic populations under a single administrative framework while fostering cultural synthesis on a scale not seen again until the modern era. The Seleucid contribution to Hellenistic culture extended far beyond the mere transplantation of Greek institutions to eastern territories. The empire served as a vast laboratory for cultural experimentation, where Greek architectural principles merged with local building traditions to create distinctive regional styles that influenced construction throughout the ancient world. The great temple complexes at Baalbek and Dura Europos demonstrated how Seleucid architects adapted classical Greek forms to accommodate the ceremonial requirements of Eastern religions, creating spaces that could serve multiple communities simultaneously while maintaining architectural coherence. The characteristic Seleucid combination of Greek colonnades with Iranian fire altars and Mesopotamian astronomical observation platforms became a template for religious architecture that persisted long after the empire's collapse. Urban planning under the Seleucids achieved levels of sophistication that would not be matched until Roman imperial expansion reached its peak. Cities like Antioch on the Orontes and Seleucia on the Tigris incorporated Greek orthogonal street layouts with Eastern concepts of ceremonial space, creating urban environments that could accommodate populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands while maintaining the civic institutions that defined Hellenistic political life. The Seleucid innovation of covered colonnades that protected pedestrians from harsh climatic conditions while providing spaces for commercial and social interaction became a standard feature of Eastern Mediterranean urban design, influencing city planning from Anatolia to Egypt. The artistic synthesis that flourished under Seleucid patronage produced distinctive styles that combined Greek naturalistic sculpture with Eastern symbolic traditions and decorative motifs. The famous Iconium Gymnasium frieze, discovered in the remote Bactrian territories, demonstrates how Greek artists working under Seleucid patronage incorporated Indian and Central Asian artistic elements into classical compositions, creating works that spoke to diverse cultural audiences while maintaining aesthetic unity. Seleucid coinage, produced in mints from Antioch to Bactria, developed iconographic programs that balance Greek mythological themes with Eastern royal symbolism, creating visual languages that could communicate political messages across cultural boundaries. Religious syncretism under Seleucid rule achieved unprecedented levels of theological sophistication, as Greek philosophical concepts merged with Eastern mystery traditions and Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. The cult of Apollo Nabu that developed in Babylonian territories demonstrated how Greek and Mesopotamian deities could be combined in ways that preserved the essential characteristics of both traditions while creating new forms of worship that appealed to mixed populations. The Seleucid royal cult, which incorporated elements of Macedonian hero worship, Persian divine kingship, and local protective deities, established patterns of ruler veneration that would influence imperial ideology throughout the Roman period and beyond. The spread of Greek language and customs throughout the Seleucid territories created the foundation for the cultural unity that would characterize the Eastern Mediterranean world for centuries after the empire's collapse. Greek became the lingua franca of administration, commerce, and intellectual life from Anatolia to Central Asia, enabling communication between diverse populations while preserving local languages for daily use and traditional ceremonies. The gymnasium system that the Seleucids established in dozens of cities created educational institutions that trained local elites in Greek literary and philosophical traditions, while incorporating elements of Eastern learning that enriched Hellenistic intellectual culture. The administrative innovations developed by Seleucid rulers to govern their vast and diverse territories provided models that influenced subsequent empires throughout the ancient and medieval periods. The flexible system of provincial administration that balanced central authority with local autonomy enabled effective governance across cultural boundaries while maintaining the loyalty of subject populations who retained their traditional institutions. The integration of diverse military traditions within unified command structures created armies that could operate effectively across the varied terrain and climatic conditions that characterized the empire's territories, while the incorporation of local elites into imperial administration provided career opportunities that strengthened loyalty to the central government. The Seleucid approach to managing ethnic diversity through cultural accommodation rather than forced assimilation established precedents that would influence imperial policy throughout the ancient world. Unlike earlier empires that typically imposed uniform cultural standards on conquered populations, the Seleucids developed sophisticated methods for integrating different traditions within overarching political frameworks that preserved local identities while creating shared loyalties to imperial institutions. This approach enabled the empire to maintain stability across territories that encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups and religious traditions, creating a model for multicultural governance that would influence Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic imperial policies. The military innovations that emerged from Seleucid efforts to integrate diverse fighting traditions created tactical systems that influenced warfare throughout the Hellenistic period and beyond. The combination of Macedonian phalanx formations with Iranian cavalry tactics and Eastern siege techniques produced armies that could adapt to varied battlefield conditions while maintaining the disciplined coordination necessary for large-scale operations. The extensive use of war elephants in coordinated formations that integrated these animals with infantry and cavalry units established tactical principles that influenced military thinking throughout the ancient world, while Seleucid innovations in siege warfare contributed to the development of artillery and fortification techniques that would characterize medieval military engineering. The adaptation of Macedonian institutions to the vast territorial scales required for governing the Seleucid Empire created administrative precedents that would influence imperial organization throughout subsequent history. The development of efficient communication systems that could transmit messages across thousands of miles of difficult terrain established postal networks that would serve as models for later empires, while the standardization of weights, measures, and currency across diverse territories created commercial frameworks that facilitated long-distance trade. The integration of local legal traditions within imperial judicial systems provided templates for managing legal pluralism that would influence Roman law and subsequent legal developments throughout the Mediterranean world. The economic legacy of the Seleucid Empire proved even more enduring than its political innovations, as the trade networks and commercial practices developed during 3 centuries of imperial rule continued to function long after the dynasty's collapse. The great caravan routes that connected the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea reached their highest levels of organisation and efficiency under Seleucid administration, creating commercial systems that would sustain long-distance trade throughout the Roman and early Islamic periods. The standardization of commercial practices across vast territories enabled merchants to operate with confidence across cultural boundaries, while the development of sophisticated financial instruments facilitated the movement of capital across the known world. Urban development under Seleucid rule established patterns of city planning and municipal organization that would influence urban growth throughout the eastern Mediterranean for centuries after the empire's fall. The systematic foundation of new cities in strategic locations created networks of urban centres that could serve as administrative, commercial, and cultural focal points for surrounding territories, while the careful attention to infrastructure development ensured that these cities could sustain large populations and complex economic activities. The Seleucid emphasis on creating mixed populations in their urban foundations established demographic patterns that would characterize eastern Mediterranean cities throughout the Roman and Byzantine periods. Agricultural innovations developed in Seleucid territories, particularly the sophisticated irrigation systems that sustained intensive cultivation in Mesopotamia and Central Asia, provided technological foundations that would support population growth and economic development for millennia. The integration of different agricultural traditions from across the empire's territories created farming systems that maximized productivity while adapting to varied climatic and soil conditions. The development of new crops and cultivation techniques through the exchange of agricultural knowledge between different regions established patterns of technological transfer that would continue long after political fragmentation had ended imperial unity. The monetary systems established by Seleucid rulers created standards of value and exchange that facilitated commercial activity across vast territories while providing governments with reliable sources of revenue through taxation and tribute. The high-quality silver coinage produced in Seleucid mints became accepted currency throughout the ancient world, maintaining its value and recognition long after the empire's collapse. The sophisticated understanding of monetary policy that Seleucid administrators developed through managing diverse economic systems provided precedents that would influence fiscal policy throughout subsequent history. The historiographical assessment of Seleucid achievements has evolved significantly as modern scholarship has gained access to archaeological evidence and documentary sources that provide more balanced perspectives on the empire's role in ancient history. Early modern historians, working primarily from Roman sources that emphasize Seleucid failures and defeats, tended to portray the empire as a declining remnant of Alexander's conquest that contributed little to historical development. However, archaeological discoveries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have revealed the extent of Seleucid cultural and economic achievements, while providing evidence for the empire's positive contributions to ancient civilization. Modern scholarly debates about the empire's significance have focused particularly on its role as a bridge between East and West that facilitated cultural and technological exchange on an unprecedented scale. The Seleucid territories served as conduits through which Greek philosophical and scientific knowledge reached Indian and Chinese civilizations, while Eastern religious and artistic traditions influenced Mediterranean culture through Seleucid intermediation. This cultural transmission had lasting effects that extended far beyond the empire's chronological boundaries, influencing intellectual development throughout the ancient world and contributing to the synthesis of traditions that would characterize later Islamic civilization. The assessment of Seleucid military capabilities has similarly been revised as scholars have gained better understanding of the tactical innovations and organizational achievements that enabled the empire to maintain control over vast territories for nearly 3 centuries. Rather than viewing Seleucid armies as inferior copies of earlier Macedonian forces, modern historians recognize them as sophisticated military organizations that successfully adapted classical Greek warfare to the diverse challenges presented by governing territories that extended from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The integration of different military traditions within unified command structures created tactical flexibility that enabled Seleucid forces to operate effectively against varied enemies while maintaining the discipline necessary for large-scale campaigns. The broader context of ancient world history has been significantly enriched by improved understanding of Seleucid contributions to political, economic, and cultural development. The empire's role in maintaining stability and prosperity throughout the eastern Mediterranean during the crucial centuries between Alexander's conquests and Roman expansion provided the foundation for many of the achievements traditionally attributed to later periods. The preservation and transmission of Greek learning through Seleucid educational institutions ensured that classical knowledge would survive the political upheavals that characterized the late Hellenistic period, while the development of new synthetic traditions created cultural resources that would influence subsequent civilizations. The Seleucid Empire's ultimate failure to maintain political unity should not obscure its remarkable success in creating sustainable institutions and cultural frameworks that outlasted dynastic collapse. The administrative systems, commercial networks, and cultural institutions that the Seleucids developed continued to function under Roman, Parthian, and later Islamic rule, providing continuity that bridged the transition between different imperial systems. The cities that Seleucid rulers founded remained important centres of population and economic activity throughout subsequent history, while the cultural synthesis that developed under imperial patronage influenced artistic, intellectual, and religious development for centuries after the dynasty's extinction. The transformation of the ancient world that resulted from Seleucid cultural and political innovations established precedents that would influence imperial organization and cross-cultural interaction throughout subsequent history. The empire's demonstration that diverse populations could be successfully integrated within unified political frameworks while maintaining their cultural identities provided models that would be emulated by later empires from Rome to the Islamic caliphates. The sophisticated approaches to religious toleration, legal pluralism, and cultural accommodation that the Seleucids developed established standards for imperial governance that would influence political theory and practice throughout the medieval and early modern periods. As the last Seleucid strongholds fell to Roman administration and the final claimants to the throne disappeared into historical obscurity, the empire that had once stretched from the Aegean to the Indus left behind a legacy that extended far beyond its political boundaries. The cultural synthesis, administrative innovations, and economic systems that had developed during 3 centuries of imperial rule provided foundations that would support the continued development of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations long after the Seleucid name had been forgotten. In the grand sweep of ancient history, the Seleucid Empire stands as a remarkable achievement in cross-cultural governance and a crucial link in the chain of development that connected the classical world with the cosmopolitan civilizations that would follow. The empire's ultimate dissolution marked not failure but transformation, as its contributions were absorbed into the larger historical currents that would shape the ancient world's evolution toward the complex, interconnected civilizations of late antiquity and the medieval period.